In the twilight of America's Gilded Age, a strange paradox emerged. A generation of women born into unprecedented wealth, privilege, and global attention found themselves living lives defined not by comfort, but by collapse. Their names glittered in the society columns. Their beauty was immortalized by painters and sculptors. Their fortunes built mansions that resembled royal palaces and financed lifestyles that stretched across continents. Yet, behind every portrait, behind every diamond tiara, behind every triumphant society debut, lay a reality far more fragile than the glittering facade suggested. This was the hidden truth of the Gilded Age. Wealth could illuminate a life, but it could not protect a soul. And for some, unimaginable privilege only amplified the dangers waiting in the shadows: mental illness, addiction, public scandal, romantic manipulation, and the crushing weight of expectations they never chose. The women whose stories we examine today were once celebrated as symbols of aspiration and excess. Their lives were chronicled with fascination, envy, and obsession. But each story ends the same way, with everything lost. Their tragedies became cautionary tales, revealing the human cost of a world built on appearances, competition, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. This episode uncovers the rise and ruin of these socialites not as gossip, but as historical case studies in the psychological, cultural, and economic pressures that shaped their destinies. Through them, we see how a society obsessed with image left little room for authenticity, emotional support, or personal freedom. We begin with the woman once hailed as the most beautiful in Europe, a muse of artists, a fascination of royalty, and a figure whose downfall began with a single decision that altered not only her face, but her fate. Gladys Deakin, the Duchess, who vanished into madness. To understand the extraordinary tragedy of Gladys Deakin, one must first understand the power she held at the height of her youth. In Belle Époque Europe, where beauty was currency and conversation, an art form, Gladys possessed both in such abundance that even the era's most celebrated minds were captivated by her. Marcel Proust wrote of her with breathless admiration. Rodin sculpted her. Painters competed for the privilege of capturing her profile. She was the rare combination of striking beauty, keen intelligence, and enigmatic charm, an irresistible muse in an age desperate for aesthetic perfection. But the foundations of Gladys's life were laid not in salons and palaces, but in trauma. Born into a wealthy American expatriate family in Paris, she seemed destined for an idyllic childhood until her father murdered her mother's lover in a scandal that electrified international newspapers. Gladys, at just 11 years old, watched her family implode in a spectacle of violence, humiliation, and legal battles. Her father's subsequent descent into madness and death in an asylum left Gladys terrified of inheriting the same fate. This early trauma created a psychological fault line that would follow her into adulthood. Yet, for a time, she rose above it, conquering Europe with her intelligence, her wit, and her arresting beauty. She became the most painted woman of her era, a symbol of aesthetic perfection. But perfection is a dangerous pursuit. Obsessed with classical proportions, Gladys underwent one of the earliest paraffin cosmetic injections, an experimental procedure intended to sculpt her nose into the shape of a Greek statue. Instead, the injected wax began migrating, melting, distorting her features slowly and irrevocably. The face that had once inspired masterpieces transformed into a haunting reminder of beauty undone by vanity. Yet Gladys refused to retreat. For 15 years, she had been orchestrating the most patient seduction in aristocratic history, the pursuit of the Duke of Marlborough. She befriended his unhappy wife, Consuelo Vanderbilt. She inserted herself into Blenheim Palace. She became indispensable, then irresistible, and eventually, she became the Duchess of Marlborough. But marriage did not deliver salvation. Instead, it accelerated her unraveling. Her paranoia grew. Her eccentricities multiplied. Her once brilliant mind, shaken by disappointment and disfigurement, began to mirror the instability she had feared since childhood. She filled the palace with unruly dogs. She kept a revolver at her bedside. She quarreled publicly, threatened privately, and slipped further into isolation. When the Duke finally expelled her from Blenheim, she retreated into rural obscurity, living as a recluse, wandering fields in tattered clothing, speaking to no one, firing warning shots at children who taunted her. She denied her own identity, insisting, Gladys Deakin, she never existed. She spent her final 15 years in a psychiatric hospital, dying at 96, forgotten by the world that once adored her. Gladys Deacon's life reveals the psychological costs of a society that valued women primarily for their appearance, their marriages, and their social utility. She was a woman who began life as a muse and ended it as a mystery, a cautionary tale about perfectionism, trauma, and the fragility of identity in a world obsessed with beauty. Evelyn Walsh McLean, the Heiress and the Hope Diamond. Born in the rugged mining towns of Colorado, Evelyn Walsh McLean entered life not with a silver spoon, but with a gold-veined mountain. The Campbird mine made her father one of the richest men in America. What she inherited was not simply wealth, it was storybook wealth, the kind that turned ordinary families into dynasties. Her entrance into Washington society seemed to promise a life of glittering triumphs. Her marriage to Ned McLean united two powerful American fortunes, the Walsh mining empire and the Washington Post publishing dynasty. Their wedding gifts alone cost more than some mansions. Her social calendar placed her in the orbit of presidents, industrial giants, diplomats, and royalty. And then came the diamond. The Hope Diamond, 45.52 carats of rare blue fire. A gem whispered to be cursed, a stone said to bring ruin to all who possessed it. Evelyn, spirited and skeptical, laughed at the legends. She wore it to baseball games. She let her Great Dane parade through the house, wearing it around its neck. She believed she could not be touched by superstition, but tragedy crept into her life with chilling precision. Her young son was killed by a car. Her husband descended into alcoholism, madness, and institutionalization. Her fortune, once colossal, was drained by mismanagement, the Great Depression, and the costs of maintaining a lifestyle built on spectacle rather than stability. Even the Washington Post, the symbol of her family's power, was lost. Evelyn pawned the diamond. She reclaimed it. She clung to it as though its brilliant fire might reverse her misfortunes. It never did. She died at 60, financially strained, emotionally battered, outliving two of her children and leaving behind the world's most famous gemstone as the final witness to her downfall. The Hope Diamond now sits behind bulletproof glass in the Smithsonian, admired by millions. Evelyn's story, however, remains a reminder that even unimaginable wealth cannot insulate a life from grief, instability, or loss. In November of 1930, as the Great Depression tightened its grip on the nation, New York's elite gathered at the Ritz-Carlton for one of the most extravagant celebrations the city had ever seen. The guest of honor was one 8-year-old girl draped in silk, diamonds, and the heavy expectations of an American dynasty. Her name was Barbara Woolworth Hutton. The ballroom shimmered with the kind of excess that defied the time's 4 orchestras, thousands of flowers, jeweled party favors filled with unmounted gemstones, breakfast served at dawn after a night of unrestrained revelry. Newspapers called it the event of the decade. But beneath the spectacle lay a truth that few could see. The girl at the center of it all was already profoundly alone. Barbara Hutton was heir to the Woolworth fortune, a retail empire that transformed American consumer culture. By age 12, she had inherited what amounted to nearly $500 million in today's currency. Hers was a life built on trust funds, international estates, couture wardrobes, and jewels that rivaled royal collections. Wealth insulated her from want but not from sorrow. Her early life was marked by emotional devastation. At 5 years old, she discovered her mother's lifeless body in their home, an image that seared itself into her memory. Rumors of suicide intertwined with whispers of her father's infidelity. What followed was a childhood spent drifting from one household to another, raised by servants and distant relatives, her emotional needs eclipsed by the enormity of her inheritance. When she reached adulthood, Barbara possessed every material advantage imaginable. But the world saw her not as a woman, but as prey. Her beauty and vast fortune attracted a succession of suitors, princes, counts, diplomats, athletes, actors, many of whom saw marriage to Barbara as a financial opportunity rather than a romantic commitment. Over time, she would enter 7 marriages, each one beginning with optimism and ending in betrayal, financial drain, or public humiliation. Her first husband, Prince Alexis Mdivani, was part of a family notorious for marrying wealthy women. He spent her money with abandon, showering himself in luxuries while offering little affection in return. Her next marriage brought her a son, Lance Reventlow, the only true love in her life. Yet that relationship, too, ended in divorce. Her third marriage to Cary Grant was the most glamorous, but perhaps the least understood. Grant, already a Hollywood icon, needed none of her money, and famously refused alimony. Yet Barbara felt overshadowed, lost in the glare of his rising fame. Each union left her more wounded, more insecure, more determined to find the love she felt she had been denied since childhood. Barbara's fortune began to evaporate under the combined pressure of lavish spending, predatory partners, and financial mismanagement. By the 1960s, her once limitless wealth had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. Yet even as her resources dwindled, her generosity remained boundless, often to the wrong people. She gave away diamonds as casually as others gave handshakes. She financed lifestyles for men who offered her affection only long enough to access her bank accounts. Meanwhile, her physical and mental health deteriorated. Addiction took hold, barbiturates and alcohol becoming constant companions. She suffered from anorexia, chronic pain, and near blindness. Her world shrank to a hotel suite in Beverly Hills, where she lived surrounded not by friends or admirers, but by hired staff and fading memories. The greatest tragedy came in 1972, when her beloved son Lance died in a plane crash. Barbara never recovered from the loss. Her grief, already heavy with decades of abandonment and betrayal, became unbearable. By the time she died in 1979, Barbara Hutton, once one of the wealthiest women on earth, had almost nothing left. Reports claim she possessed as little as $3,500 at her death, a symbolic figure that mirrored the emotional bankruptcy of a life lived in the glare of public fascination but devoid of private security. Her funeral was quiet, attended by only a small cluster of relatives and friends. There were no orchestras, no jeweled party favors, no headlines trumpeting her grandeur. She returned to the Woolworth family mausoleum, alone. Barbara's life reflects a recurring theme of the Gilded Age. Money could buy homes, jewels, gowns, and parties, but it could not buy love, safety, or peace. Her downfall was not the result of excess alone, but of a world that preyed upon vulnerability dressed in diamonds. Dorothy Arnold, the socialite who walked into Manhattan and disappeared forever. The disappearance of Dorothy Arnold remains one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries of the early 20th century, a case born from privilege, secrecy, and a society obsessed with appearances. Dorothy came from impeccable lineage. Her father, Francis Arnold, built a lucrative perfume importing empire. Her extended family included Supreme Court connections and Mayflower ancestry. Their mansion on East 79th Street stood as a testament to wealth solidified across generations. Dorothy was raised in that world of mahogany-paneled drawing rooms, Parisian gowns, and the rigid expectations placed on daughters of New York's old money. But beneath her refined exterior beat the heart of a woman yearning for independence. She longed to be a writer. She dreamed of Greenwich Village, where artists and intellectuals challenged every social norm she had been trained to obey. Her family dismissed her ambitions as trivial, even humorous. Her rejected manuscripts returned from publishers with the quiet but devastating finality of a door closed in her face. But she did not stop writing. On the 12th of December 1910, Dorothy dressed carefully, a tailored blue suit, a velvet hat with silk roses, gloves, a fox muff, and a purse containing $25 and a mysterious letter she had read many times. She left her home in perfect composure, as she always did. No one knew she was walking into history. She visited a chocolate shop. She visited a bookstore. She purchased a collection of literary sketches. She spoke to a friend on Fifth Avenue, appearing cheerful and untroubled. She was last seen walking towards Central Park, and then she vanished. No body, no clothing, no confirmed sighting. Her family's response only deepened the mystery. Rather than immediately contacting police, they kept her disappearance secret for 6 weeks, fearing scandal more than tragedy. They hired private investigators across the nation and Europe. They interrogated friends, servants, strangers. They even considered the possibility of an illicit pregnancy or elopement. None of it produced answers. Theories began to swirl. Kidnapping? Unlikely, no credible ransom ever emerged. Suicide? Possible, but no remains were ever found, despite extensive searches. Secret pregnancy and death during a botched procedure? A theory quietly circulated among investigators but never proven. Escape and reinvention? A romantic notion, but unsupported by evidence. In the end, Dorothy Arnold became less a missing person and more a symbol of the pressures placed on wealthy young women, the fear of scandal that constricted their lives, and the devastating consequences of silence. Her parents died never knowing their daughter's fate. The case remains unsolved. Dorothy's story endures because it reveals a truth the Gilded Age tried desperately to hide, that beneath the glittering surface of privilege, the women who seemed to possess everything were often the most trapped of all. Across the stories of Gladys Deacon, Evelyn Walsh McLean, Barbara Hutton, and Dorothy Arnold, one pattern emerges with startling clarity. These women were born into unimaginable wealth, but raised inside emotional deserts. Their lives became studies in contradiction, worshipped publicly, ignored privately, surrounded by grandeur, yet starved for stability, protected by money, yet emotionally abandoned by the very structures that upheld their world. In the salons of Paris, the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, the ballrooms of Washington, and the mansions of Newport, these women seemed to embody everything. Society celebrated beauty, grace, wealth, refinement, and yet each one ultimately faced challenges that their fortunes could not shield them from. Mental illness, emotional trauma, manipulation, addiction, financial ruin, and in Dorothy's case, disappearance itself. Their lives illustrate the hidden architecture of the Gilded Age, a system built to preserve legacy, image, and propriety, not human well-being. For Gladys Deacon, beauty was both weapon and prison. Her obsession with classical perfection reflected a culture that demanded flawlessness from its women while punishing them the moment they faltered. Her descent into paranoia and eventual institutionalization stands as one of the era's starkest reminders that public adoration cannot cure private torment. For Evelyn Walsh McLean, the Hope Diamond became a metaphor for inherited power, dazzling, dangerous, and impossible to control. Her belief that she could defy the curse mirrored the optimism of America's rising fortunes, but her life ultimately exposed how fragile such confidence could be. Wealth insulated her from financial ruin for a time, but not from tragedy, scandal, or the collapse of the family empire. For Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth millions acted less like a foundation and more like a target. The emotionless childhood she endured left her vulnerable to suitors who saw her not as a person, but as an investment. Her desperate search for love, expressed through 7 disastrous marriages, revealed the profound emptiness that can hide behind privilege. Her final years, frail, isolated, and nearly penniless, illustrate how excess can hollow a life rather than enrich it. And for Dorothy Arnold, the constraints of her social world proved as dangerous as any physical threat. Her desire for independence collided with a family whose greatest priority was reputation. Her disappearance, sealed behind 6 weeks of silence, showed that in a world obsessed with appearances, truth is often sacrificed first. These stories, though separated by decades and circumstances, converge on the same haunting truth. The Gilded Age created perfect images of womanhood and then crushed the women inside them. It fashioned ideals of beauty that no human face could maintain. It enforced standards of behavior that stifled emotional authenticity. It demanded marriages of status rather than affection. It discouraged individuality, ambition, and autonomy, especially among wealthy daughters. It treated women as symbols, ornaments, assets, or liabilities, but rarely as full human beings. Their lives revealed the psychological pressures hidden beneath silk gowns, diamond tiaras, and marble staircases. The greater their wealth, the smaller the space they were allowed to inhabit emotionally. They were expected to be flawless, composed, and useful at all times, never troubled, never rebellious, never vulnerable. But vulnerability is not optional, it is human. When denied outlets, creativity, emotional support, freedom, connection, vulnerability becomes instability, and instability becomes tragedy. The legacy of loss, what their ruins reveal about their era. The destruction of these women's fortunes was not merely personal misfortune, it reflects the broader collapse of the Gilded Age itself. The same forces that shaped their stories, economic inequality, social rigidity, inherited privilege, public scrutiny, shaped a nation struggling to reconcile wealth with humanity. Their downfalls mirrored the unraveling of the upper class as the 20th century progressed. Mansions crumbled, dynasties fractured, fortunes evaporated under the weight of modernity, taxes, wars, and shifting cultural values. These women were not failures, they were warnings. Warnings that systems built on appearances cannot sustain real lives. Warnings that beauty fades, money moves, reputations shatter, and legacies crumble. Warnings that emotional neglect has consequences no inheritance can erase. Warnings that privilege without protection is simply a different kind of vulnerability. In their struggles, we see the fault lines of an entire era, an age of glamour stretched so thin that it eventually collapsed under its own weight. The final message, what we learn from their ruins. Gladys Deacon, Evelyn Walsh McLean, Barbara Hutton, and Dorothy Arnold live on not through their portraits, jewels, or newspaper clippings, but through the truths their lives reveal. That wealth without emotional grounding becomes a curse. That beauty without stability becomes a trap. That fame without freedom becomes a cage. That privilege without empathy becomes a slow undoing. These women remind us that human needs do not change with fortune. Love, security, connection, purpose, these cannot be purchased or inherited. They must be nurtured. Their tragedies were not inevitable. They were the products of a world that valued women for everything except their humanity. Today, the mansions they lived in have been demolished or turned into museums. The jewels they wore sit behind glass. The newspapers that chronicled their triumphs and scandals have yellowed into silence. But their stories remain deeply relevant because the pressures they faced, social perfection, public scrutiny, emotional neglect, echo loudly in our own age. Their ruins are history. Their lessons are timeless. In examining the lives of the Gilded Age socialites who lost everything, it becomes clear that their tragedies were not isolated misfortunes, but chapters in a larger narrative about a society built on unsustainable illusions. These illusions manifested in drawing rooms, newspapers, art studios, auction houses, and marriage markets, spaces where appearances were currency and failure was a scandal to be buried, not confronted. The gilded surfaces of their world marble halls, couture gowns, royal jewels concealed a deeper truth. The immense spiritual fragility of a culture that prized display above authenticity. In this milieu, even the most privileged women found themselves performing lives curated for spectators rather than designed for their own fulfillment. Their power was decorative, their agency was optional, their worth was conditional. Nowhere was this dynamic more visible than in the rigid social architecture that governed their romantic lives. For Gladys Deacon, the pursuit of a duke required a carefully orchestrated performance, accompanied by calculated charm, measured intellect, and the suppression of vulnerability. Her marriage was not a union built on love, but a strategic elevation staged over 15 years. When the facade cracked, everything behind it collapsed with devastating speed. Similarly, for Evelyn Walsh McLean, the Hope Diamond became a symbolic object within this performance, a jewel meant to broadcast fortune, status, and invincibility. Yet over time, it reflected something far more turbulent: the unraveling of her marriage, the instability of her wealth, and the fragility of her family. Even as the diamond's brilliance endured, her own world dimmed. Barbara Hutton, meanwhile, operated in a sphere where wealth made her desirable to everyone except the people whose affection she genuinely sought. Her 7 marriages reveal a pattern repeated across the upper echelons of society: emotional vulnerability exploited for financial gain, companionship replaced by manipulation, and romance reshaped into a transactional theater in which she was always the target and rarely the beneficiary. Dorothy Arnold, unlike the others, did not live long enough to expose her unraveling publicly, but her disappearance represented the ultimate failure of her gilded world, a life so tightly controlled that her very absence became an embarrassment to be concealed rather than a tragedy to be confronted. Her family's secrecy illustrated the dark undercurrent of a society more concerned with reputation than rescue. Through these stories, a profound psychological landscape emerges, one shaped not by wealth's abundance, but by its consequences. Money, rather than granting freedom, imposed constraints. Privilege, rather than offering security, intensified scrutiny. Visibility, rather than ensuring connection, amplified isolation. For these women, their fates were shaped before they were old enough to recognize the contours of their own identities. From the moment they entered society, they were commodities presented at debutante balls, photographed in couture, paraded at charity galas, and woven into narratives about national prosperity. Their emotional lives were secondary to their social functions. Their marriages were extensions of family strategy. Their suffering was an inconvenience to be hidden. This dynamic created a cycle in which emotional needs were repeatedly unmet, leading to compensatory behaviors that played out across their adult lives. Obsessive pursuit of beauty, compulsive spending, unhealthy relationships, and in some cases, psychological collapse. Yet their stories also reveal a lesser discussed truth: the generational patterns of trauma embedded within wealthy families. In Gladys's case, the violence of her father's crime fractured her sense of stability. In Evelyn's, her family's rapid ascent created pressures she could never reconcile with her personal losses. In Barbara's, emotional abandonment was masked by material abundance. In Dorothy's, strict parental control suffocated her aspirations. Despite their material differences, all four women wrestled with the same underlying deficit: a lack of unconditional emotional support. This absence rendered them susceptible to the illusions of their age. The illusion that beauty guaranteed security, the illusion that wealth guaranteed happiness, the illusion that marriage guaranteed protection, the illusion that social status guaranteed purpose. None of these illusions held true. And when they collapsed, each woman faced consequences that money could not mitigate. As the Gilded Age transitioned into the modern era, many of its structures crumbled. Palaces were demolished, estates were sold, family fortunes dissolved. But perhaps the most significant collapse was not architectural or financial, it was cultural. The expectations placed on women of privilege were no longer sustainable in a society becoming more mobile, more scrutinized, and more psychologically aware. These women were stepping stones between eras. Their suffering marked the end of an age when emotional needs could be ignored without consequence. As the 20th century advanced, the stories of the fallen Gilded Age socialites were increasingly interpreted not simply as personal misfortunes, but as reflections of wider cultural transformations. Their lives became case studies for emerging disciplines: psychology, sociology, and women's studies, all of which sought to understand how immense wealth could coexist so closely with profound unhappiness. One theme scholars consistently return to is the paradoxical nature of privilege. While wealth can provide access to opportunities, it can also isolate its holders from genuine human connection. This was particularly true for the women of these dynasties, who were often raised not to pursue their own fulfillment, but to uphold the stability and public image of their families. In this sense, they were less individuals and more institutions, extensions of dynastic continuity. Their education, clothing, manners, and public behavior were curated to advertise their lineage, not their personalities. In such an environment, they learned quickly to conceal vulnerability. Their identities were shaped externally, not internally. The emotional consequences of this dynamic were immense. For many, personal desires became indistinguishable from societal expectations. When they deviated, pursuing unconventional romance, expressing creative ambition, or rejecting the roles laid out for them, they encountered resistance so powerful that it threatened the fabric of their lives. Dorothy Arnold's longing for a literary career illustrates this tension. Her ambition was dismissed not because of her talent, but because it contradicted her family's image of propriety. When her manuscripts were rejected, the ridicule she faced at home amplified the sting of failure. She existed in a world where her dreams had no sanctioned place, and where secrecy became her only form of rebellion. For Gladys Deacon, perfectionism became a vessel through which deeper anxieties expressed themselves. Her obsession with classical beauty reflected the impossible standards imposed upon her. That a minor perceived flaw could drive her to undergo a dangerous experimental procedure shows how deeply enmeshed her identity was with public perception. Beauty was not merely an asset, it was a requirement. In Evelyn Walsh McLean's life, we see how fortune, when untempered by emotional grounding, can foster illusions of control. She believed she could defy the legendary curse of the Hope Diamond because she had grown up witnessing wealth overcome every obstacle. Yet her life soon revealed that tragedy finds its way even into palaces and drawing rooms. Her losses were not the result of superstition, but of human vulnerability: marriage to an unstable man, the death of a child, the fall of a family empire. Barbara Hutton's story perhaps most vividly encapsulates the destructive potential of privilege devoid of nurturing. Her childhood trauma, discovering her mother's body, enduring neglect, and being treated as a valuable asset rather than a valued child, created a lifelong hunger for affection. The world responded to this hunger by exploiting it. Her wealth became bait for opportunists, and her heart, already fragile, was repeatedly shattered. This phenomenon was not unique to these four women. Across wealthy families of the Gilded Age, emotional neglect was widespread. Parents consumed by business, society, and travel often delegated child-rearing to governesses and tutors. Affection was scarce. Expectations were immense. Appearances mattered more than connection. These conditions created generations of emotionally underdeveloped heirs who struggled to maintain healthy relationships. Many sought solace in material excess, public attention, or self-destructive behaviors. Their lives became emblematic of a larger societal truth. When emotional needs are suppressed in favor of social obligations, even vast wealth cannot prevent psychological collapse. As the century progressed, the public began reassessing the meaning of these tragedies. Were these women victims of circumstance, of societal expectations, of their own decisions, or were they victims of a culture that mistook luxury for love? Increasingly, historians argue that their downfalls were not the result of personal weakness, but of structural pressures embedded in the very fabric of the Gilded Age. These pressures included rigid gender roles. Women were expected to marry well, host impeccably, and maintain beauty. Ambitions outside these duties were discouraged. Societal surveillance. The press monitored their movements, relationships, clothing, and appearances, creating a sense of constant performance. Transactional marriages. Many unions were strategic alliances rather than partnerships grounded in emotional compatibility. Emotional suppression. Expressions of sadness, ambition, or individuality were seen as improper. Inheritance pressures. Women who inherited vast fortunes were particularly vulnerable to manipulation. Fear of scandal. Families often prioritized reputation over safety, as seen in the Arnold case. Against these forces, personal resilience could only go so far. The stories of Gladys, Evelyn, Barbara, and Dorothy demonstrate that emotional well-being cannot flourish in environments where authenticity is punished and vulnerability is exploited. Their falls from grace were not aberrations, they were symptoms of a social order straining under its own contradictions. The Gilded Age promised immortality through wealth, beauty, and legacy. Yet in these women's lives, we see how fragile such promises truly were. As the world moved beyond the Gilded Age, the legacies of these women became subjects of fascination not merely because of their tragedies, but because of what their stories revealed about the shifting understanding of human identity. The age they belonged to defined people by lineage, reputation, and material expression. The age that followed would increasingly define people by psychology, personal freedom, and emotional truth. In this transition, the stories of these fallen socialites serve as bridges, illustrating the consequences of a world that had not yet caught up to the humanity of the individuals living within it. For Gladys Deacon, the psychological unraveling that eventually overtook her was viewed by contemporaries as eccentricity or madness. Today, historians interpret her breakdown through a more nuanced lens. Childhood trauma, isolation, body dysmorphia, social pressure, and the emotional volatility of unfulfilled ambition created a perfect storm. Her fall was not a scandal, it was a delayed reckoning with wounds she had carried since girlhood. Her self-imposed exile, living in filth on a small English farm, frightened local children and bewildered former acquaintances. But, to modern observers, it illustrates how untreated mental illness often manifests in environments where emotional support is absent. Gladys's intellectual brilliance never disappeared. She read voraciously in the asylum, debated eagerly with visitors, but her identity fractured under the weight of decades spent performing a role she never truly controlled. Evelyn Walsh McLean's life, too, gains new clarity when viewed through a psychological frame. Her near-mythological relationship with the Hope Diamond was less about superstition and more about control. After losing her child, her marriage, and finally the family newspaper empire, the diamond became a symbol of continuity in a life characterized by destabilization. While newspapers sensationalized the curse, the real horrors in her life were human, not supernatural. Mental illness in her husband, alcoholism, grief, and societal upheaval. Barbara Hutton's saga offers perhaps the clearest illustration of how emotional deprivation in childhood can shape adult behavior. Her desperate gift-giving, chaotic marriages, and reliance on destructive coping mechanisms all point to an internal void that wealth magnified rather than filled. Each palace she purchased, each husband she secured, each couture gown she wore was an attempt to quiet a hunger that had been growing since she was 5 years old, a need for care, belonging, and unconditional love. In her final years, weakened by addiction, isolation, and chronic illness, Barbara inhabited a world that bore no resemblance to the splendor she once commanded. The girl who had once hosted the most extravagant debutante ball of the century died largely alone, with only a faded inheritance and fractured memories to keep her company. Her story is no longer seen as simply a fall from grace, but as a case study in the long-term cost of emotional neglect masked by material abundance. Dorothy Arnold, whose fate remains unknown, continues to haunt American cultural memory. Her disappearance acts as a mirror, reflecting the invisible struggles of countless upper-class women who appeared outwardly composed while internally suffocating. The secrecy her family imposed, delaying police involvement, withholding information, attempting to manage the narrative, reveals the Gilded Age obsession with reputation at the expense of truth. In many ways, Dorothy's final walk down Fifth Avenue symbolizes the entire era. Elegant, controlled, and seemingly invincible, yet carrying within her a world of turmoil unseen by the public eye. That she vanished without a trace was not only a mystery, it was a symbolic indictment of a society that refused to see its daughters clearly enough to save them. Her story endures because it raises questions that remain unresolved. How many young women of that era disappeared emotionally long before they disappeared physically? How many lived trapped inside gilded cages, unseen even by those closest to them? How many defied expectations quietly, subtly, until one day their silence swallowed them whole? Each woman's downfall, whether through madness, addiction, disappearance, or financial devastation, reveals how brittle the structures of privilege can be when they rest on emotionally empty foundations. Their wealth protected them from the ordinary hardships faced by most Americans, but it also exposed them to unique vulnerabilities that cut deeply and invisibly. Their tragedies were not random. They were patterned. The Gilded Age shaped its daughters into objects of admiration, not subjects of their own lives. It offered them visibility without voice, luxury without stability, beauty without autonomy, and reputation without support. Within these contradictions, they each struggled, faltered, and eventually fell. Modern historians now view them not as cautionary tales of extravagance, but as early casualties of a society transitioning from traditional constraints to modern individuality. They lived on the fault line between two eras, carrying the emotional costs of a world collapsing under the weight of its own illusions. As the 20th century progressed, the stories of Gladys Deacon, Evelyn Walsh McLean, Barbara Hutton, and Dorothy Arnold did not fade. Instead, they evolved into powerful cultural symbols. Each woman became a lens through which later generations examined the emotional costs of wealth and the psychological toll of social restriction. Their lives, once consumed by gossip, now serve as historical evidence of a deeper phenomenon, the silent suffering embedded within privilege. By the mid-century, researchers, biographers, and cultural critics began reassessing their legacies with a sensitivity denied to them in their own lifetimes. Where newspapers once mocked them as eccentric, cursed, spoiled, or foolish, modern scholars saw patterns of trauma, loneliness, and systemic pressure. These reinterpretations transformed the sensationalism of their day into cautionary narratives for future eras. For example, Gladys Deacon's dramatic transformation from society beauty to institutionalized recluse can no longer be dismissed as the eccentric downfall of a once celebrated woman. Today, her life is understood as a complex interplay between childhood trauma, public scrutiny, body dysmorphia, and untreated mental illness. Her obsession with beauty was shaped by a culture that viewed women as visual symbols of dynastic pride, and her eventual collapse was compounded by decades of isolation and emotional repression. In her decline, historians see a portrait not merely of madness, but of a brilliant mind crushed under rigid expectations. Her final denial of her own identity, Gladys Deacon never existed, reflects not delusion, but a profound internal conflict between who she was and who she was forced to become. Evelyn Walsh McLean's life, similarly, reveals how grief can distort reality when not met with compassion. Her losses, the death of her child, the breakdown of her marriage, and the collapse of her family empire were overwhelming, yet society focused disproportionately on the diamond she wore. The myth of the cursed Hope Diamond overshadowed the human suffering behind the headlines. In truth, Evelyn's tragedy was not supernatural. It was the result of emotional devastation met with inadequate support. Her attachment to the diamond, viewed today, appears less a defiance of superstition and more an attempt to maintain continuity in a world unraveling around her. The diamond stayed constant as her life changed violently. It became a talisman of stability, even as everything else slipped from her grasp. Barbara Hutton's story, too, has been recontextualized. Rather than a poor, little rich girl, she is now regarded as a woman whose childhood trauma sculpted an adulthood filled with unhealthy relationships. Each marriage promised solace but delivered exploitation. Each lavish home offered luxury but not safety. Each diamond she purchased or gave away reflected a desperate attempt to secure affection. Her addiction, wasted fortune, and eventual physical deterioration reveal the cumulative effect of decades spent seeking emotional fulfillment in material symbols. Scholars now argue that had she been born into a family willing to nurture rather than delegate her upbringing, the trajectory of her life could have been radically different. Dorothy Arnold's disappearance remains one of the most compelling examples of the era's emotional cruelty. The fact that her family waited 6 weeks before alerting authorities speaks volumes about the power of reputation over reality. The concealment of her disappearance was not merely an error, it was a reflection of the Gilded Age's refusal to acknowledge vulnerability within its elite circles. Her case is now studied not just as a missing person mystery, but as an indictment of the social structures that trapped women in silence. Dorothy's dreams, ambitions, heartbreaks, and frustrations were overshadowed by the family's fear of public scrutiny. She vanished physically, but she had been disappearing emotionally long before that December afternoon. Beyond the individual tragedies, these stories illuminate the broader collapse of the Gilded Age social order. The era's obsession with grandeur proved unsustainable against the pressures of modernity. Wealth became less secure, social hierarchies began to dissolve, and the emotional deficits embedded in old-world aristocratic structures became impossible to ignore. Through the lens of these women's lives, we witness the unraveling of an entire worldview, a worldview where image outweighed individuality, where wealth replaced emotional support, where marriages were transactions, where freedom was an illusion, where mental illness was hidden, where loss was endured privately, where women were admired more than they were understood. And yet, their stories persist because they reveal universal truths about the human condition. Their challenges, loneliness, the pursuit of approval, the pain of unmet expectations resonate even today. Their downfalls remind us that suffering does not discriminate by wealth or status. Their legacies implore us to create societies that value authenticity over appearance, nurture over neglect, compassion over control. As time distances us from their world, empathy replaces judgment. We begin to see these women not as symbols of excess, but as human beings navigating impossible circumstances. Their tragedies cease to be scandals, and instead become lessons, warnings about the cost of ignoring emotional needs, about the dangers of conflating wealth with well-being, and about the invisible weight carried by those who seem to have everything. Their stories endure because they demand that we look beyond the gilding, beyond the jewels, beyond the ballrooms, beyond the headlines. They ask us to confront the humanity beneath the glamour, the part that is fragile, yearning, and profoundly familiar. As historians and psychologists continued to examine the Gilded Age through the lens of individual human experiences, a striking realization emerged. The downfall of these socialites was not accidental, it was systemic. Their tragedies were not deviations from the norm, but predictable outcomes produced by the rigid structures of privilege in which they lived. The Gilded Age created a culture where emotional expression was often considered a weakness and vulnerability a liability. Families like the Arnolds, the Woolworths, the McLeans, and the Deacons rose to prominence through discipline, stoicism, and the illusion of perfection. Their daughters were expected to perform the same roles, regardless of internal turmoil. This created a cycle in which entire generations were raised without the emotional tools required to navigate their increasingly public lives. Within this world, appearances became both shield and weapon. A perfect profile, a dazzling debut, an opulent wedding, a mansion filled with priceless art. These were not merely personal achievements, they were public performances meant to reinforce the family's position within a competitive aristocracy. Yet the burden of these performances fell disproportionately on the women, who were required to embody elegance while suppressing anything that threatened the facade. Gladys Deacon's disfigurement shattered more than her beauty, it disrupted the image she was expected to maintain. Her husband, whose admiration had been rooted in her physical perfection, recoiled. Society, which had once celebrated her face, now recoiled as well. In an era obsessed with presentation, her altered appearance made her socially obsolete. Her decline into reclusion reflects the brutal consequences of being a woman whose worth had been tied to her surface. Similarly, Evelyn Walsh McLean's public grief was often interpreted through sensational lenses. Rather than acknowledging her emotional suffering, reporters clung to the narrative of the Hope Diamond's curse. This tactic reduced her trauma to entertainment and obscured the reality of her losses. The public preferred a supernatural explanation to the more painful truth. Even the wealthiest families were vulnerable to breakdown, addiction, and instability. In Barbara Hutton's case, her extreme generosity giving away jewels, homes, cars, and financial gifts was often mocked by tabloids as evidence of foolishness. Yet modern understandings of trauma reveal her generosity as a coping mechanism, a way of purchasing the affection she never received in childhood. Her vulnerability made her the perfect target for opportunists, and her emotional wounds deepened with each betrayal. Her final years, lived in frail seclusion, illustrate what happens when unlimited wealth meets unlimited emotional neglect. Dorothy Arnold's disappearance magnifies the era's darkest truth. A woman's inner life mattered far less than the family's reputation. The decision to remain silent for 6 weeks was not merely a mistake, it was a deliberate prioritization of image over survival. Her parents' fear of scandal eclipsed the urgency of finding their daughter. Their silence not only hindered the investigation but ensured that Dorothy's story would forever remain shrouded in uncertainty. Today, her case symbolizes the countless silenced crises hiding behind gilded doors. Taken together, these narratives demonstrate that the Gilded Age built its monuments on unstable ground. The world these women inhabited was magnificent, yet deeply fragile. The social structures designed to elevate them were the same structures that eventually failed them. Their experiences invite us to reconsider the myth of Golden Age glamour by exposing the emotional toll required to maintain it. Their struggles also reveal something important about how privilege can distort relationships. Wealth often attracts admiration, envy, opportunism, or dependency, but rarely unconditional love. Each woman sought connection, but found instead a revolving cast of figures drawn to their fortunes rather than their hearts. This imbalance created cycles of betrayal and disappointment that no amount of luxury could soften. In the modern world, we have the language to recognize their suffering: codependency, trauma bonds, body dysmorphia, depression, anxiety, unresolved childhood grief, and emotional abandonment. In their world, these conditions had no names, only consequences. Through the tragedies of these women, we see that emotional needs are universal. They transcend class, wealth, and social standing. When those needs go unmet, even the most glittering life can fracture. Their stories also force us to confront uncomfortable questions about modern society. How many people today still chase external validation at the expense of internal peace? How many still equate worth with appearance, status, or wealth? How many still collapse under pressures they cannot express? The gilded expectations of the past echo through the present in ways both subtle and profound. This is why these narratives endure. Each woman's downfall illuminates a different facet of human vulnerability. Each story challenges us to look beyond surfaces. Each life warns of the danger in confusing material abundance with emotional security. And each tragedy reminds us that behind every glamorous facade lies a human heart that feels, breaks, mourns, and hopes like any other. The deeper one examines the lives of these Gilded Age socialites, the more apparent it becomes that their stories represent not just personal tragedies, but psychological case studies illustrating how human beings respond to environments shaped by extreme imbalances of power, wealth, emotional availability, and societal expectation. Their worlds may seem distant, adorned with opulence and marked by privilege, but the core dynamics that shaped their destinies remain strikingly familiar. In Gladys Deacon's world, the pressure to maintain physical perfection was not a private dilemma, it was a public requirement. Her beauty was currency, an asset that granted her access to palaces, salons, and intellectual circles. But like any fragile commodity, it was vulnerable to devaluation. The paraffin injection that altered her face so dramatically was not an act of vanity alone. It was a symptom of a society that taught women their appearance determined their power. When her beauty collapsed, so too did her social identity. She had been sculpted into a muse, but not permitted to exist as a flawed human being. Her transformation into a recluse, her erratic behaviors, and her eventual institutionalization demonstrate how the expectations placed upon her far exceeded what any one person could realistically bear. Society worshipped her as an aesthetic ideal but failed to recognize her as a complex individual battling trauma and insecurity. Her story is a powerful reminder that when a person's worth is reduced to a single attribute, the loss of that attribute can be catastrophic. Evelyn Walsh McLean's life reveals another dimension of Gilded Age pressure, the illusion of immunity. Born into wealth during a time when America's self-confidence was soaring, she believed, like many of her peers, that tragedy could be transcended through money, optimism, or sheer willpower. Her ownership of the Hope Diamond symbolized this belief. She saw herself as untouchable, someone who could defy the fate that had haunted its previous owners. But life proved otherwise. Her son's death, her husband's descent into madness, and the eventual loss of her newspaper empire shattered the illusion of control she had cherished. Evelyn's tragedy underscores a reality often overlooked in accounts of wealthy families. Money can delay suffering, distract from it, disguise it, but it cannot prevent it. Her reliance on the diamond as a source of strength highlights how people in crisis often anchor themselves to symbols when emotional foundations are weak. Barbara Hutton's story perhaps resonates most deeply with modern audiences because it reveals a truth that spans class and era. Childhood trauma can shape a lifetime. The emotional abandonment she experienced did not disappear. As she grew older, it intensified. Her lavish spending, her unstable relationships, her generosity toward those who exploited her, and her struggles with addiction all point to an internal void she spent decades trying to fill. Her extraordinary wealth amplified her vulnerability. Instead of protecting her, it attracted individuals who viewed her not as a partner, but as an opportunity. With each financial loss and broken relationship, she became more fragile. Her final years, marked by illness and isolation, reveal how prolonged emotional deprivation can erode even the strongest external facade. Dorothy Arnold's disappearance, meanwhile, illustrates the consequences of a culture that values reputation above humanity. Her parents' refusal to alert authorities for 6 weeks demonstrated that maintaining the appearance of normalcy was more important than risking embarrassment. In doing so, they inadvertently shaped the outcome of the entire investigation and perhaps sealed their daughter's fate. The secrecy surrounding Dorothy's disappearance mirrors the silence that characterized many wealthy families of the era. Emotional suffering was concealed behind thick curtains and heavy doors. Domestic issues were handled quietly to prevent scandal. Women were taught to endure, to repress, to conform. In such an environment, Dorothy's desire for independence, creativity, and romance created tension that had no acceptable outlet. Her disappearance remains unsolved not only because of investigative failures, but because of social expectations that hindered the truth from emerging when it mattered most. From a broader historical perspective, these women's stories reveal the downfall of a social system that was never built to sustain emotional well-being. The Gilded Age, for all its splendor, was fundamentally performative. Its mansions were showcases, not homes. Its marriages were alliances, not partnerships. Its social events were competitions, not celebrations. Its expectations were suffocating, not supportive. Within this framework, the emotional experiences of women, joy, fear, ambition, insecurity, grief, were rarely acknowledged. Instead, decorum was prioritized. Every smile was measured, every gesture rehearsed, every appearance scrutinized. It was a culture that demanded perfection and punished vulnerability. As these socialites' stories unfolded over the decades, the world around them began to change. Psychology emerged as a field that recognized trauma. Women's rights movements challenged traditional roles. Economic upheaval dismantled the illusion of permanent wealth. And slowly, the narratives of these once-mocked women were reinterpreted through a compassionate lens. Their lives became evidence of a truth that resonates across time. No amount of wealth can substitute for emotional security. In the absence of love, connection, validation, and support, even the richest lives can become unstable. Their tragedies are no longer viewed as failures of character, but as consequences of a system that prized appearances over authenticity. The deeper one traces the emotional arcs of these Gilded Age socialites, the more clearly a broader pattern emerges, a pattern woven not from individual weakness, but from the social architecture that defined their world. These women became the embodiment of a cultural moment that prized spectacle above substance, lineage above liberty, and decorum above personal truth. Their individual tragedies were symptomatic of a society that viewed its daughters not as autonomous human beings, but as reflections of family prestige. This dynamic is evident in the quiet desperation that underlies many of their stories. Their lives were filled with glittering distractions: balls, soirees, couture gowns, seasonal migrations from Palm Beach to Newport to Paris. Yet beneath the surface, most lived without the emotional scaffolding necessary to withstand hardship. When crisis arrived, whether through grief, scandal, or personal failure, the world they inhabited offered little support. This was most apparent in the case of Dorothy Arnold. The carefully maintained illusion of her family's perfection prevented effective action during the critical early days of her disappearance. Her parents' decision to protect their social standing over their daughter's safety reflects the priorities of an era where reputation often outweighed responsibility. In the years after she vanished, the silence surrounding her fate became a quiet indictment of a society more concerned with appearances than with the inner lives of its most vulnerable members. Barbara Hutton's life similarly highlights how privilege can distort one's sense of self. From her childhood, she learned that attention, not affection, was the measure of her value. As she grew older, she sought validation through relationships. Yet the men drawn to her wealth saw her as an opportunity rather than a partner. Their betrayals compounded her emotional wounds, pushing her further into dependence on substances and destructive behaviors. Over time, her wealth became not a resource, but a burden that magnified her suffering. For Evelyn Walsh McLean, society's fascination with the curse of the Hope Diamond trivialized the real tragedies she endured. Headlines focused on superstition, ignoring the emotional devastation that shaped her life. Her story illustrates how easily spectacle can overshadow human suffering when the person involved occupies a position of privilege. The public consumed her misfortunes as entertainment rather than acknowledging her grief. Gladys Deacon represents perhaps the most haunting example of the psychological pressures embedded in the expectations of elite society. Her obsession with ideal beauty mirrored the societal obsession with aesthetic perfection. Her mental collapse was not simply the result of personal instability, but the culmination of decades spent striving to meet an impossible standard. Her eventual retreat into isolation and madness offers a stark commentary on the toll of being seen but never understood. As historians re-examine their stories, they view these women not as cautionary tales about extravagance, but as early casualties of emotional neglect and societal constraint. Their downfalls were not failures of character. They were symptoms of an environment that demanded compliance, but offered no emotional refuge. The social structures of the Gilded Age provided these women with physical luxuries but denied them what human beings require most: connection, understanding, agency, and unconditional support. Their immense fortunes could purchase everything except the one thing each of them desperately needed: a stable identity grounded in emotional truth. This realization invites a reconsideration of the Gilded Age itself. Behind the facade of prosperity lay deep cracks: social isolation, gender inequality, and unspoken trauma. The era produced extraordinary wealth, but also extraordinary pressures. Its glittering veneer concealed emotional realities that society was not equipped to address. When the Gilded Age ended, the collapse of its fortunes mirrored the collapse of its illusions. Many of the great mansions were demolished, their marble staircases and gilded ceilings reduced to rubble. The dynasties built on retail, steel, railroads, and speculation dissipated across generations. The world changed, but the stories of these women endured, offering insight into the psychological foundation of an age built on image. What remains today are not the jewels, nor the estates, nor the newspaper headlines, but the lessons embedded in their lives. That emotional neglect can undermine the strongest foundation. That wealth cannot buy safety from the vulnerabilities of the human condition. That beauty cannot shield one from pain. That reputation cannot replace intimacy. That silence can be more dangerous than scandal. That the appearance of perfection often conceals profound instability. These women's stories remind us that suffering is not confined to those without resources. It can reach into palaces as easily as it does into poverty. And when it does, the silence imposed by privilege can amplify its impact. Their lives compel us to look beyond opulence and see the human stories underneath stories of longing, fear, heartbreak, resilience, and collapse. And in understanding their lives more fully, we uncover truths not just about the past, but about ourselves. What transformed these stories from isolated tragedies into enduring cultural parables was not simply the scale of the losses these women endured, but the visibility of those losses. In an age ruled by newspapers, gossip columns, and society pages, every misstep became public property. Their lives were dissected by strangers who knew nothing of their inner worlds. Their grief became entertainment. Their misfortunes became headlines. This relentless scrutiny magnified their vulnerabilities. The press that once praised Gladys Deacon's beauty later mocked her disfigurement. The newspapers that celebrated Evelyn Walsh McLean's social triumphs were the same ones that published lurid accounts of the Hope Diamond curse. Reporters who marveled at Barbara Hutton's debutante ball later ridiculed her failed marriages and financial ruin. The media frenzy surrounding Dorothy Arnold's disappearance transformed her from a daughter into a spectacle. In each case, the public narrative moved further and further away from the truth of their experiences. Their stories were reshaped into morality tales, warnings about vanity, extravagance, and the dangers of excess. Yet these depictions obscured the deeper emotional realities that defined their lives. Modern interpretations finally allow us to look past the caricatures. Gladys was not a vain beauty destroyed by obsession, but a traumatized woman seeking control in a world that had repeatedly taken it from her. Evelyn was not a reckless heiress cursed by a gem, but a grieving mother navigating unimaginable loss. Barbara was not a foolish, poor little rich girl, but a neglected child who spent decades searching for the affection she never received. Dorothy was not a flighty socialite who vanished irresponsibly, but a young woman suffocated by expectations she could not reconcile with her desires. Their stories reveal the consequences of a society that expected its women to be perfect, beautiful, composed, obedient, and silent. This expectation was not merely cultural, but structural. It determined the paths they followed, the choices they were allowed to make, and the boundaries within which they were forced to live. The Gilded Age's social machinery operated with precision. Daughters of wealthy families were given the best tutors, the finest gowns, and the grandest coming-out balls yet. Their lives were meticulously curated to ensure they conformed to the roles their families required of them. Their education prepared them to be ornaments, not individuals. Their marriages were alliances, not unions built on love. Their reputations were assets to be guarded, not reflections of their true selves. Inside this world, autonomy became a precious and rare commodity. Gladys's attempt to pursue intellectual passions made her unusual. Dorothy's desire to become a writer was quietly discouraged. Barbara's pursuit of personal happiness became overshadowed by her wealth. Evelyn's independent spirit was gradually eroded by tragedy and social expectation. Each woman attempted to carve a space for herself within the rigid confines of her social class. Each encountered resistance that shaped and ultimately destabilized her life. Their tragedies resonate because they reveal the emotional cost of a society that conflated wealth with fulfillment. We often assume extreme privilege insulates individuals from suffering, but these stories demonstrate the opposite. Privilege can amplify suffering by limiting access to authenticity, boundaries, and support systems. In studying their lives, one finds that wealth did not prevent loneliness, it deepened it. Privilege did not protect them from exploitation, it invited it. Visibility did not ensure understanding, it obstructed it. Status did not grant security, it undermined it. These women lived in gilded cages, admired by the world but often unseen by the very people closest to them. When they fell not from luxury into poverty, but from illusion into reality, a reality stripped of the emotional tools required to survive. And yet, their stories persist because they illuminate truths that remain deeply relevant. That emotional health cannot be bought. That inherited roles can become invisible prisons. That perfection is a burden, not a blessing. That silence is often more dangerous than scandal. That trauma, when unacknowledged, echoes across a lifetime. Their lives serve as reminders that behind every gilded facade lies a person capable of suffering, dreaming, longing, and breaking. Their tragedies are not cautionary tales about wealth, but about the human cost of denying vulnerability. The Gilded Age is long gone, its mansions demolished or repurposed, its fortunes scattered, its dynasties dissolved. But these women, through their beauty, their ambition, their grief, and their collapse, remain alive in the cultural memory, urging us to examine the worlds we create and the expectations we impose on those who inhabit them. They remind us that wealth may glitter, but the human heart remains fragile. The collapse of these women's lives also mirrors a larger historical phenomenon, the slow but inevitable crumbling of the Gilded Age itself. As the 20th century unfolded, the social systems that had defined the previous era began to erode under the pressure of new cultural forces, psychology, feminism, economic shifts, and changing social values. The world that once celebrated extravagant displays of wealth now questioned them. The expectations that had once governed women's lives no longer held the same power. The families that had dominated society found themselves confronted by modernity in ways they could neither control nor reverse. For many socialites, the transition into the modern era was destabilizing. The skills they had been trained to perfect, hosting, presenting, curating social appearances, grew obsolete. The social codes that once provided structure now confined them. The world was no longer impressed by grand balls or towering mansions. It began to admire independence, intelligence, and self-determination, qualities these women possessed but were rarely allowed to express. This shift left many of them stranded between worlds. Gladys Deacon, with her expansive intellect, might have thrived in a later era that valued women's ideas as much as their appearance. Instead, she lived in a time that placed disproportionate emphasis on beauty, punishing her the moment her physical appearance ceased to conform to an idealized standard. Her disfigurement and subsequent retreat into isolation reflect not personal weakness, but a culture incapable of seeing beyond the surface. Evelyn Walsh McLean, whose lively spirit and bold temperament made her well-suited for public life, found herself trapped within the decaying structures of elite society. Her losses mirrored the decline of the old aristocratic families who discovered too late that inherited wealth could not withstand the geopolitical forces of the 20th century. Her story parallels the transformation of the United States, from a nation dominated by robber barons to one shaped by regulation, reform, and mass culture. Barbara Hutton, whose image was immortalized in newspapers and magazines, became an early casualty of celebrity culture. She lived in an era when private suffering was publicized and public appearances masked deep emotional wounds. Her downfall was not merely financial, it was spiritual. She became one of the first women to experience the isolating effects of global fame in a world that had not yet learned how to protect the well-known from the vultures circling their lives. Dorothy Arnold, whose fate remains unknown, stands as a symbol for the countless women whose desires were dismissed by families, unwilling to imagine a world where daughters might choose their own paths. Her disappearance haunts history not because of its mystery alone, but because it exemplifies how the silencing of women can have irreversible consequences. Her story remains frozen in time, an unsolved reflection of a broader silencing experienced by women of her class. As modern readers examine these lives, patterns emerge that transcend the specifics of each story. These women were not undone by extravagance, they were undone by rigid structures that denied them emotional autonomy. The wealth that surrounded them acted as both armor and cage, protecting them from everyday hardship while exposing them to unique vulnerabilities. Consider the emotional environment in which they were raised. Affection was delegated to nurses and governesses. Communication was formal, suppressed, and filtered through etiquette. Parents were often physically present but emotionally distant. Expectations were explicit, while love was conditional. Marriages were strategic, not intimate. Emotions were concealed to preserve the family's image. Within such an environment, emotional resilience could not easily take root. When losses came, as losses always do, they struck devastatingly. When relationships faltered, there were few support systems to fall back on. When identity crises emerged, there were no safe spaces for reflection. When mental illness surfaced, it was hidden, denied, or punished. Their stories thus reveal an essential truth. Wealth cannot insulate people from suffering, but it can isolate them from healing. Historians now view the downfall of these women through a more compassionate lens. Their experiences illustrate the dangers of environments that prioritize social control over emotional well-being. Their stories challenge romanticized portrayals of the Gilded Age, revealing the human cost behind the grand estates and lavish parties. And perhaps most importantly, their narratives remind us that every era produces its own form of invisible suffering. In our time, the pressures may differ: social media, career expectations, economic uncertainty, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. the desire to present perfection, the fear of vulnerability, the weight of societal expectations, the struggle for identity, the longing for connection. These women lived at the intersection of immense privilege and immense pressure, and their lives were the battlegrounds upon which these forces collided. Their tragedies are not relics of a bygone era, they are warnings that still echo. In re-evaluating the lives of these Gilded Age socialites, one realizes that their stories did not end with their deaths or disappearances. Instead, they live on as powerful commentaries on the era that shaped them, evidence that history is not simply a record of events, but a reflection of the societal values that produced those events. The world they inhabited was constructed on an illusion that prosperity could insulate its elite from the human condition. Their families believed that wealth could prevent tragedy, protect reputation, and guarantee happiness. Yet their stories reveal the opposite. Wealth amplified trauma, reputation suppressed truth. Visibility magnified vulnerability. And happiness, far from being guaranteed, became elusive, something to be pursued endlessly, yet rarely secured. Their emotional fractures were not private matters but public spectacles. Their struggles became proxies for national narratives about fortune, fate, and femininity. And as the decades passed, their names became shorthand for archetypes. Gladys Deacon, the beauty destroyed by perfectionism and mental illness. Evelyn Walsh McLean, the heiress haunted by tragedy and superstition. Barbara Hutton, the poor little rich girl, broken by abandonment and exploitation. Dorothy Arnold, the vanished socialite, eclipsed by silence and secrecy. But these archetypes simplify stories that were far more complex. Beneath each public persona lay a woman wrestling not only with external pressures, but with internal battles shaped by childhood trauma, societal limitations, and emotional invisibility. The tragedy of these women is not merely that they fell, but that they fell alone. Their wealth prevented intervention. Their reputation silenced questions. Their families turned inward. Their social circles offered sympathy without support. Their public status prevented them from seeking help. This pattern reveals the paradox at the heart of privilege. The more visible one becomes, the more one's suffering disappears from view. For Gladys Deacon, madness did not appear suddenly. It emerged over years of unaddressed trauma and declining self-image. But instead of receiving compassion, she became an object of fascination, then avoidance. Her deterioration was treated as entertainment by some, embarrassment by others, and tragedy by almost no one. She was remembered for her beauty, yet forgotten as a person. Evelyn McLean's grief was similarly dismissed. The sensational myth of the Hope Diamond overshadowed the real causes of her despair. Her losses were reframed as supernatural punishment rather than the natural consequences of human vulnerability. The public preferred a dramatic narrative to a compassionate one because empathy disrupts the tidy myths that society tells itself about the wealthy. Barbara Hutton's emotional instability was attributed to indulgence, not trauma. Her generosity was called foolish, not reflective of a desperate need for affection. Her marriages were mocked, never understood as attempts to create family in a life defined by abandonment. The world watched her fall with fascination, rarely acknowledging the forces that pushed her toward the edge. Dorothy Arnold's disappearance became a riddle to solve, not a person to mourn. Her family's silence, meant to preserve their reputation, ensured that she faded into myth rather than memory. The investigation, hindered by secrecy and pride, revealed more about the era's priorities than about Dorothy herself. In each story, the public consumed the spectacle but ignored the suffering. Over time, these narratives took root in American cultural consciousness. They became cautionary tales about excess, reinforcing the belief that money cannot buy happiness. Yet modern scholarship reframes these stories as cautionary tales not about wealth, but about the absence of emotional support and the dangers of suppressing identity. Their lives expose the fault lines of an age that prioritized image over truth, control over compassion, and lineage over love. Their struggles underscore the necessity of a cultural shift, a shift that would eventually emerge through social reform movements, psychological research, and the expansion of women's rights. Today, their stories invite us to reflect on our own era, where different forms of pressure continue to shape lives in equally profound ways. The pressure to maintain a perfect online presence. The pressure to meet societal expectations of success. The pressure to conceal mental health struggles. The pressure to conform to cultural ideals of beauty. The pressure to appear strong, even when breaking. Their experiences remind us that the human need for understanding, authenticity, and connection is timeless. The external conditions change, technology evolves, social norms shift, but the inner battles remain. Through their lives, we learn that the foundations of resilience are emotional, not material. That identity cannot be built on performance alone. That silence can be a form of violence. That compassion must replace spectacle, and that even the most gilded worlds can collapse if they neglect the fragile hearts beating inside them. As the stories of these Gilded Age women continued to circulate through time, they began to take on a life beyond their biographies. Their experiences became mirrors, reflecting the deeper flaws of the era, flaws that modern readers can still recognize within our own systems of status, identity, and expectation. One of the most striking parallels between their era and ours is the pressure to curate a perfect life. For Gladys, Evelyn, Barbara, and Dorothy, this meant maintaining flawless appearances, impeccable social reputations, and effortless composure. These expectations were imposed externally, by families, by society, and by the media of their day. But over time, they became internalized standards these women tried desperately to uphold, even as their emotional worlds fractured beneath them. This pressure transformed their lives into performances. Their days were structured around visibility photographs, public outings, galas, interviews, and social obligations. Every gesture conveyed meaning, every outfit carried significance, every whisper in a ballroom could alter reputations. In such a world, authenticity became nearly impossible. The divide between public image and private emotion widened until it became a gulf. And it was in this gulf that their tragedies unfolded. For Gladys Deacon, the break between who she was and who she was expected to be became irreconcilable. Her face, the most public part of her identity, became a battleground for these conflicting demands. When it changed, the world saw it as failure. They did not recognize the deeper emotional turmoil driving her decisions. They did not see the shadow of her father's violence, the instability of her youth, or the loneliness of being reduced to a symbol. Society had celebrated Gladys as an ideal, but abandoned her when she ceased to embody that ideal. Evelyn Walsh McLean's life revealed another form of fracture, the gap between public optimism and private despair. The world saw her as rebellious, charming, and unshakable, a woman who laughed at curses and flaunted diamonds. But beneath that confidence lay profound grief, compounded by the belief that she should remain cheerful, composed, and socially engaged. Tragedy struck repeatedly, yet she never allowed herself to step out of the role expected of her. Her exuberant public persona masked a life unraveling under the weight of loss. Barbara Hutton's story shows how the pressure to present happiness can magnify emotional emptiness. Photographs captured her clad in jewels, stepping out of limousines, dancing in ballrooms, strolling through her global estates. But these images concealed the turmoil of a woman searching for connection in a world where affection was transactional. Her attempts to create love through lavish gifts, impulsive marriages, and generous acts were misinterpreted as frivolity. The world saw extravagance. It failed to see the longing behind it. Dorothy Arnold lived in a quieter version of this gap. Her outward life appeared stable, refined, and structured. She walked the streets of Manhattan dressed impeccably, shopping for chocolates and books, appearing every bit the cultivated society daughter. Yet her inner world held dreams of independence, romance, and authorship, dreams that her family dismissed as impractical. That conflict between expectation and aspiration was never resolved. Her final walk down Fifth Avenue remains haunting because she was performing normalcy on the outside while carrying turmoil within. Across these women's lives, we see a common thread. They were allowed to be visible, but not allowed to be honest. Their images were public property, but their struggles were private burdens. Their joy was celebrated, but their sorrow was concealed. Their roles demanded that they embody perfection, but perfection is impossible to sustain. The collapse of the Gilded Age itself reflects this impossibility. Despite its glittering facade, the era was built on unstable foundations. Unequal wealth distribution, rigid gender roles, social hierarchies, and the myth of endless prosperity. When the pressures of modernity arrived, economic upheaval, war, social reform, the illusion shattered. Just as the era fell, so did the women who personified it. Yet in their downfalls, they revealed truths about the human spirit. Their lives underscore the importance of emotional nurturing, personal autonomy, and psychological support elements their world denied them. Their stories remind us that suffering does not discriminate, that pain can penetrate even the most opulent lives, and that humanity cannot be replaced by status. Through their tragedies, these women unintentionally became pioneers of a new cultural understanding. They exposed the emotional costs of performance-based living. They challenged future generations to see beyond appearances. They offered a silent plea for compassion, authenticity, and empathy, values that would become central to the modern world. Their legacies today are not measured by the jewels they wore or the estates they owned, but by the lessons embedded in their stories. As we study their lives, we gain insight into our own, the dangers of chasing external validation, the limits of perfection, the price of silence, the necessity of emotional connection, the fragility beneath the facade of strength, the universal need to be seen, understood, and loved. These women, once symbols of excess, have become symbols of something far more profound, the resilience and vulnerability at the heart of the human experience. As modern scholars reinterpret the lives of Gilded Age socialites, another striking realization comes into focus. Their tragedies were not isolated, but interconnected, shaped by the same cultural forces that defined an entire generation of elite women. These forces did not simply influence their choices, they sculpted their destinies. To understand these women fully, one must examine the ecosystem in which they lived, an ecosystem sustained by excess, restrained by conformity, and driven by a relentless pursuit of social distinction. The Gilded Age produced towering fortunes, but it also produced invisible walls. Within those walls, young women were often raised in emotional isolation despite material abundance. Their lives were curated by governesses, shaped by tutors, monitored by chaperones, and orchestrated by parents who prioritized reputation over intimacy. Love was not something they received unconditionally. More often, it was something they were expected to earn through grace, beauty, compliance, and social performance. This upbringing created a particular psychological landscape marked by high external pressure and low internal support, public scrutiny and private silence, lavish surroundings and emotional emptiness, constant visibility and profound loneliness. These conditions would follow them into adulthood, silently dictating how they navigated relationships, handled disappointment, coped with trauma, and interpreted their own self-worth. Take Gladys Deacon. Her extraordinary intelligence was celebrated privately yet discouraged publicly. Society loved her beauty but had no use for her mind. When her appearance changed and she could no longer embody the ideal society had imposed on her, she became disposable. Her descent into paranoia and reclusion was the culmination of decades spent trying to preserve an identity that was never allowed to evolve. Evelyn Walsh McLean's buoyant personality masked the grief that repeatedly punctured her life. Her refusal to acknowledge despair publicly was not pride, it was conditioning. She had been taught from childhood that sorrow must be hidden, that optimism was a duty, and that appearances mattered more than truth. Her tragedies, far from being curses, were the predictable consequences of a world that dismissed emotional vulnerability. Barbara Hutton's compulsion to give money, jewels, affection, was a symptom of a deeper wound, a lifelong fear of abandonment. Her extravagant generosity was not wasteful indulgence. It was a survival strategy, a desperate attempt to secure connection in a world where people loved her fortune more than her humanity. Her emotional breakdowns, addictions, and failed marriages were not signs of weakness, they were cries for the love she never received as a child. Dorothy Arnold's disappearance remains the most haunting because it embodies the silence that permeated upper-class society. Her dreams of independence were dismissed. Her passion for writing was minimized. Her parents, more concerned about scandal than safety, delayed notifying authorities, highlighting a chilling truth. Preserving the family's image mattered more than preserving their daughter's life. Whether Dorothy ran away, met with misfortune, or was harmed, the conditions that enabled her disappearance were created long before her final walk down Fifth Avenue. Across all their stories, a pattern emerges. These women were punished not for their mistakes, but for their humanity. Punished for wanting autonomy, punished for dreaming beyond the roles assigned to them, punished for expressing emotion, punished for failing to uphold an image crafted by others. Their narratives force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that privilege can mask suffering, not eliminate it. Wealth may create comfort, but but it does not create emotional safety. Social status may command admiration, but it does not provide genuine connection. Luxury may offer distraction, but it does not heal wounds. If anything, their wealth intensified their pain by surrounding them with people who viewed them as opportunities rather than individuals. In their loneliness, each woman became a symbol, not of extravagance, not of excess, but of the human cost of a society that valued perfection over authenticity. Today, their lives serve as powerful case studies for psychologists, examining the effects of emotional neglect and societal pressure on identity formation. They reveal how children raised without secure emotional attachments struggle to form stable relationships later in life. People conditioned to hide their emotions develop fragile coping mechanisms. Environments that reward performance over honesty encourage self-destruction. Being surrounded by people does not prevent loneliness when those people value what you have more than who you are. Their stories, once sensationalized by tabloids and gossip columns, are now understood through the lens of trauma, mental health, and emotional deprivation, all concepts unavailable to them during their lifetimes. In this sense, their suffering contributed, albeit tragically, to a broader cultural awakening. As society evolved, as psychology advanced, as gender roles changed, the tragedies of these women became cautionary markers along the road to progress, reminding us that emotional well-being must be prioritized alongside achievement, that identity cannot be outsourced, and that silence is often more harmful than scandal. Ultimately, their stories reveal a profound truth. The downfall of the Gilded Age's brightest socialites was not the result of their wealth, but of the emotional worlds hidden behind it. And in revealing those worlds, they illuminate the human condition itself. As we continue examining these women's lives, another profound pattern emerges. The rigidity of gender roles in the Gilded Age not only limited their opportunities, but also shaped the trajectory of their emotional and psychological decline. Expectations for women in elite society were not simply guidelines, they were mandates enforced by family, tradition, and reputation. The ideal Gilded Age woman was expected to be beautiful, but not vain, educated, but not ambitious, charming, but not outspoken, wealthy, but modest, sociable, but never scandalous, intelligent, but never challenging. These contradictions created an impossible standard, one that trapped women within roles that denied their complexity and punished their individuality. For many, the only permissible face to show the world was one of polished perfection. This impossibility created pressure that accumulated silently, like steam beneath a gilded surface. Their external lives sparkled, but their internal lives teetered under the strain of unmet emotional needs, repressed desires, and identities that were never allowed to fully emerge. Gladys Deacon's brilliance, for example, had no proper outlet. She spoke multiple languages, engaged with the greatest minds of her era, and had an intellect that rivaled her beauty. But intellectual women were unsettling to the aristocracy. Celebrated privately, dismissed publicly, her inability to reconcile her mind with her expected role contributed to the internal tension that later consumed her. Evelyn Walsh McLean, with her exuberant personality and adventurous spirit, thrived in the social sphere, but struggled with the private emotional burdens placed upon her. Her grief over the deaths of her children and the unraveling of her marriage was dismissed by many as the eccentric behavior of a wealthy heiress rather than the natural response of a mother in mourning. Her emotional suffering was misunderstood, minimized, and ultimately exploited. Barbara Hutton, raised not as a child but as a symbol of a retail empire, never learned that her value extended beyond her fortune. She excelled at performing the role society carved out for her: glamorous, generous, adored, but she never received the emotional foundation necessary to withstand love's disappointments. Her failures were ridiculed publicly, even as her story echoed the experiences of countless women across all classes: the yearning for love, the fear of abandonment, and the consequences of unhealed childhood wounds. Dorothy Arnold offers the starkest example of the dangers of repression. Her desire to become a writer, to create a life of her own making, clashed violently with her family's expectations. The Arnolds believed their daughter's aspirations were beneath her social standing. Dorothy's dreams were not nurtured but dismissed, stifled before they could bloom. And in that dismissal lay a tragedy, a young woman caught between the life she wanted and the life she was forced to live. It is here that the human cost of the era becomes undeniable. These women were not permitted to fail. They were not permitted to express anguish. They were not permitted to question societal norms. They were not permitted to seek independence. They were not permitted to exist outside the roles written for them. The consequences of these restrictions were profound. Without the freedom to explore their emotional needs, ambitions, or identities, these women were left to navigate crises without tools, support, or permission to be vulnerable. When the world around them shifted through war, economic downturns, scandals, or personal heartbreak, they had no emotional infrastructure to withstand it. Their families, often uncomfortable with vulnerability, responded with dismissal, denial, or silence. In this vacuum, fear flourished, isolation deepened, unspoken trauma accumulated. This unspoken trauma was not personal failure, it was cultural design, and so their stories serve as warnings about the cost of suppressing human truth. They reveal what happens when society prioritizes image over authenticity, wealth over well-being, and silence over support. These women were products of their age, but they were also casualties of it. Yet, despite the limited agency they were granted, their lives have had a powerful afterlife. They force modern audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about our own expectations, how we judge, idealize, dismiss, or overlook people based on appearance and status. Their stories challenge assumptions about glamour, reminding us that suffering can exist behind even the most dazzling facade. They also contribute to a broader cultural shift. By studying their lives, historians and psychologists alike have gained insight into how emotional deprivation can shape behavior, how trauma is transmitted silently through families, and how societal structures can inflict damage so subtly that its effects manifest decades later. Their legacies endure not because they were wealthy, but because they were human. Their vulnerability gives their stories power. Their suffering gives their stories meaning. Their courage, spoken or silent, gives their stories longevity. And through the retelling of their lives, these once misunderstood women reclaim their place in history not as cautionary tales of excess, but as complex individuals whose struggles illuminate the deepest truths of an era obsessed with image. As we examine the legacies of these Gilded Age socialites, one final profound pattern becomes clear. Their stories did not simply reveal the fragility of wealth, they revealed the fragility of identity in a world that encouraged women to become symbols rather than selves. Their lives, glamorous on the surface, turbulent underneath, became early case studies in the psychological consequences of living under the constant pressure of performance. And though their tragedies unfolded more than a century ago, the themes that shape their narratives echo powerfully across generations. To understand the full magnitude of their stories, we must look at the emotional ecosystems they inherited and the psychological landscapes they passed on. The inheritance of silence. In each of these women's families, silence was a form of currency used to maintain reputation, suppress scandal, and manage public perception. Yet this silence was also a weapon, one that cut deeply into their private lives. Gladys Deacon grew up in a household fractured by violence and scandal, events never spoken of openly, yet etched into her psyche. Evelyn Walsh McLean faced unimaginable grief, but was encouraged to maintain composure, to smile through sorrow, to avoid appearing weak. Barbara Hutton was raised in emotional scarcity, despite material abundance, taught to endure loneliness without complaint. Dorothy Arnold lived under the suffocating expectation that she would not embarrass her family, a pressure so intense that even her disappearance was kept secret. Silence, for these women, was not merely the absence of sound, it was the absence of support, the absence of emotional acknowledgement, the absence of truth. This cultural practice, common among elite families of the era, had devastating psychological effects. It prevented them from processing trauma, from seeking help, from understanding their own needs. In the vacuum created by silence, fear and confusion thrived. The burden of representation. Each woman bore not only her own identity, but the identity of her family. Gladys was expected to represent aristocratic beauty. Evelyn represented the Walsh Empire and later the Washington Post legacy. Barbara represented the Woolworth fortune, becoming a symbol of retail success. Dorothy represented the Arnold dynasty and its quest for social respectability. Their lives were not their own, they were extensions of the families that created them. Their triumphs were celebrated, but their failures were met with judgment or denial. This burden forced them into roles that rarely aligned with their inner lives. Gladys, the intellectual, was cast as the beauty. Evelyn, the free spirit, was cast as the society hostess. Barbara, the abandoned child, was cast as the glamorous heiress. Dorothy, the aspiring writer, was cast as the perfect debutante. In performing these roles, they were praised. In deviating from them, they were punished. In trying to escape them, they were lost. The trap of unmet emotional needs. Despite their differences, these women shared a fundamental truth. Their emotional needs were either ignored, misunderstood, or weaponized. Gladys's desire for perfection stemmed from a lifetime of instability and fear. Evelyn's optimism masked a deep need for emotional safety. Barbara's generosity was a plea for affection disguised as wealth. Dorothy's ambition was a longing to be more than her last name allowed. These needs were human, universal, and in their world, shameful. The results were predictable. Perfectionism became pathology. Grief became instability. Generosity became exploitation. Ambition became rebellion. Their stories reveal that emotional deprivation can occur in even the wealthiest homes. In some cases, it is more pronounced because the appearance of privilege discourages empathy. Their lives remind us that pain does not discriminate and that wealth can conceal suffering so completely that it becomes invisible. The cost of being seen and not seen. Perhaps the most striking paradox in their lives was this. They were among the most visible women of their era, and yet they were unseen. Society saw their beauty, their jewelry, their scandals, their marriages, their wealth, but it did not see their fears, their trauma, their loneliness, their aspirations, their humanity. Visibility became a form of invisibility. The public persona overshadowed the private self. They became so well known that the world forgot to look beneath the surface. This paradox remains deeply relevant today, in an age where visibility has become another form of currency and another potential burden. The quiet rewriting of their stories? Only now, with historical distance and psychological insight, can their stories be told with empathy rather than judgment. We can now see Gladys not as a fallen beauty, but as a woman crushed by impossible expectations. We can see Evelyn not as a victim of a curse, but as a mother navigating unimaginable loss. We can see Barbara not as a frivolous spendthrift, but as a child deprived of affection and seeking it her whole life. We can see Dorothy not as a foolish debutante, but as a young woman silenced by the very system that raised her. Their lives, once sensationalized, now serve as vital narratives about the human condition, about the cost of emotional neglect, the burden of expectation, and the universal need for understanding. As time distances us from the Gilded Age, the world those women inhabited begins to resemble not merely a historical period but an emotional landscape, a map of pressures, expectations, and limitations that shape their lives in profound and often irreversible ways. And through their stories, we glimpse the darkest truth of the era. The very structures designed to elevate these women ultimately contributed to their downfall. These were structures built from old money, new fortunes, dynastic ambition, rigid gender roles, and unspoken rules of social conduct. Their lives unfolded not on a blank canvas but within elaborate frameworks where every decision carried implications far beyond the personal. Within these frameworks, deviation was dangerous, vulnerability was unacceptable, and emotional honesty was nearly impossible. As a result, what appears on the surface as personal tragedy was, in reality, a systemic consequence. A culture that worshipped women, yet restricted them. The Gilded Age treated elite women as cultural symbols, icons of refinement, beauty, and lineage. They were painted, sculpted, photographed, written about, and placed at the center of social spectacle. Yet this worship was conditional. They were admired only as long as they maintained an image that served the needs of their families and society. Gladys Deacon was celebrated as a muse until her appearance changed. Evelyn McLean was adored as a lively hostess until grief reshaped her life. Barbara Hutton was envied for her wealth until that wealth became her undoing. Dorothy Arnold was groomed for perfection until she dared to imagine another path. Their value was tethered to external attributes, beauty, wealth, lineage, charm, but external attributes cannot sustain an internal life. They cannot soothe grief, heal trauma, or provide identity. When inner turmoil emerged, society had no framework for compassion. Instead, it distanced itself, often reinforcing the very forces that triggered the collapse. The psychological toll of unrelenting expectations. Modern psychology offers a vocabulary these women never had access to. emotional neglect, attachment trauma, identity suppression, perfectionism, social anxiety, dissociation, internalized shame, codependence, chronic loneliness. Their lives exemplify these concepts with stunning clarity. Gladys internalized the violence and instability of her youth, channeling it into an obsessive pursuit of unattainable perfection. Evelyn relied on optimism as a coping mechanism, masking profound sorrow that she did not feel permitted to express. Barbara developed maladaptive patterns of seeking affection through generosity, exposing her to exploitation and heartbreak. Dorothy struggled with a fractured identity, torn between her desires and her family's expectations, leading to a disappearance steeped in unspoken tensions. Their experiences reveal that psychological suffering transcends wealth. Emotional deprivation can occur in gilded halls as easily as in modest homes. And when suffering is denied or invalidated, it deepens into crisis. Society's fascination with their downfalls. One of the most chilling aspects of their stories is the public's reaction not to their lives, but to their collapses. Newspapers framed Gladys's disfigurement as scandalous spectacle. Society whispered gleefully about the tragedies that surrounded Evelyn's Hope Diamond. Tabloids chronicled Barbara's marriages with an air of ridicule rather than empathy. And Dorothy's disappearance became a media frenzy, overshadowing the actual grief of her family. Their pain was consumed as entertainment. This dynamic reveals an uncomfortable truth about human nature and society. People are often more interested in the downfall of the privileged than in understanding their struggles. These women became morality tales, stripped of complexity and reduced to cautionary warnings about vanity, extravagance, or poor judgment. But such simplifications obscure the true lessons embedded in their stories, lessons not about wealth, but about humanity, the fading of an era, and the fading of its women. As the Gilded Age faded into history through war, economic upheaval, and cultural transformation, the lives of these women became faint echoes of a world dissolving under its own weight. Some died in obscurity. Some were forgotten in institutions. Some vanished without explanation. Some lingered in memory only through sensational headlines. Their mansions were demolished. Their estates were sold. Their fortunes were scattered. Their families dispersed. But their stories remained quiet, haunting, unresolved. And with each retelling, we understand them more clearly, not as symbols of excess, but as human beings navigating impossible expectations. A mirror for our time. Their struggles resonate today not because the circumstances are identical, but because the psychological pressures endure in new forms. The demand for perfection persists, now amplified by digital platforms. The pressure to appear happy remains even when one is breaking inside. The glamorization of wealth continues even as its emotional costs remain hidden. The disconnect between public image and private reality is sharper than ever. These parallels make their stories not just historical narratives, but timeless warnings about the dangers of conflating external success with internal stability. A final, quiet truth. The tragedy of these women does not lie in the loss of their fortunes. It lies in the loss of themselves. They were raised to become symbols, yet longed to become individuals. They were admired for their surfaces, yet starved for emotional depth. They were surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. They were given everything except the freedom to be who they truly were. And so their lives remind us that no matter the era, the class, or the circumstance, human beings cannot thrive without authenticity. They cannot heal without connection. They cannot survive without meaning. And they cannot live behind a facade forever. With each layer of these women's experiences uncovered, what begins as separate biographies gradually merges into a unified narrative, one that speaks not only to individual destinies, but to an entire era's silent emotional crisis. The Gilded Age dazzled with its wealth, architecture, and social rituals, yet beneath its brilliance lay cracks that would eventually widen into chasms. Through the lives of its most celebrated socialites, we see the human cost of a culture built on performance, hierarchy, and silence. And we see, too, the quiet rebellion each woman undertook, even if that rebellion was never fully recognized or understood in her lifetime. The rebellion of Gladys Deacon, a battle against aesthetic tyranny. Gladys's downfall has often been misinterpreted as vanity gone wrong, but a closer look reveals something far more profound. A woman fighting against the limits of a role she never chose. Her obsession with classical beauty was not superficial, it was a form of control in a life shaped by chaos. Her attempt to sculpt her appearance into a work of art, to mirror the ancient faces she admired, reflects the deeper desire for agency in a world that viewed her as a decorative object. When her beauty dissolved, society withdrew its admiration, exposing how conditional its love had been all along. Her retreat into eccentricity and isolation was not madness alone, it was a refusal to continue performing a role that had destroyed her. In that refusal lies a form of tragic courage. The rebellion of Evelyn Walsh McLean, defying fate through defiance. Evelyn's life was marked by optimism in the face of tragedy, a refusal to surrender to despair even when the losses mounted. Her buoyant public persona was not naivete, it was resistance. Her ownership of the Hope Diamond, a stone burdened by myth, was an act of defiance against superstition, expectation, and even sorrow itself. Yet grief accumulated silently. Her optimism disguised unhealed wounds, her wealth shielded her from pity but also from empathy, and her public life obscured the private unraveling that eventually consumed her family. Her rebellion was the insistence that joy was still possible, but the world she lived in gave her few tools to sustain it. The rebellion of Barbara Hutton, seeking love in a loveless world. Barbara's tragedy lies not in her fortune, but in her hunger for affection. Her generosity, often ridiculed as recklessness, was a profound form of rebellion against the emotional starvation of her childhood. In a world that taught her she existed to be admired, she sought instead to be loved. She married not for strategy, but for connection. She gave not to impress, but to feel connected. She traveled the world not for spectacle, but to escape the emptiness left by those who had failed to love her. Her downfall, then, was not extravagance, it was vulnerability, exploited by those who saw her as a resource, not a person. The rebellion of Dorothy Arnold, the pursuit of an unwritten life. Dorothy's rebellion was the quietest, yet perhaps the most radical. She wanted independence, intellectual fulfillment, and a life shaped by her own choices. Her desire to write was a direct rejection of the restrictive world she inhabited, a world that prized conformity above creativity. Her disappearance remains a mystery, but her rebellion is undeniable. She wanted more than a debutante's life, more than a society marriage, more than a silent existence behind gilded doors. And whether she vanished by choice or by tragedy, the truth remains. Dorothy Arnold slipped through the cracks of an era incapable of recognizing her as anything other than a daughter of privilege. Their rebellions were not failures. They were early signs of change. These women's downfalls are not simply cautionary tales. They are case studies in the emotional consequences of restricting women's lives. Their suffering was not the result of personal weakness, it was the result of cultural design. And yet, within that suffering, each woman pushed against the boundaries of her world. They sought autonomy, authenticity, and emotional freedom long before society knew how to grant those things to women of their class. Their lives became unintentional catalysts for cultural reflection. Their tragedies exposed the limitations of inherited wealth, the inadequacy of rigid gender roles, and the fragility of reputational power. They revealed, through their own unraveling, the instability of the very system that had elevated them, the unseen thread connecting all their stories. If one steps back far enough, a single thread weaves through the lives of Gladys, Evelyn, Barbara, and Dorothy. They were all punished for being human, for grieving, for longing, for aging, for dreaming, for seeking love, for seeking autonomy, for wanting to be more than their roles allowed. In a world obsessed with perfection, their humanity became their downfall. But in a modern world that values vulnerability, their humanity becomes their legacy. The legacy they leave behind. Today, their stories serve as psychological studies, historical warnings, cultural commentaries, and emotional touchstones. They remind us that even the most privileged lives can contain devastating loneliness. They reveal that emotional neglect is not softened by wealth. They show us that visibility is not the same as understanding, and that image is not the same as identity. Their legacies are not their fortunes, their jewels, or their scandals. Their legacies are the lessons their lives teach us about compassion, authenticity, and the silent suffering hidden behind perfection. As the Gilded Age recedes further into the past, the physical remnants of that era, its marble mansions, its grand avenues, its glittering ballrooms, continue to vanish. Yet the emotional architecture of the age remains, preserved not in stone or silk, but in the stories of the women who lived through it. Their lives serve as windows into a world defined by contradictions. A world of immense wealth but profound emotional poverty, of dazzling beauty but suffocating expectations, of public admiration but deep private suffering. Through these women, the Gilded Age becomes not merely a historical moment, but a psychological landscape, a terrain shaped by privilege, pressure, reputation, and silence. And the lessons embedded in their lives speak as urgently today as they did over a century ago. The emotional cost of being adored. One of the most misunderstood aspects of these women's experiences is the emotional toll of admiration. To the outside world, they appeared to live charmed lives, surrounded by luxury and envied by millions. But admiration is not the same as affection. Being adored is not the same as being understood. Gladys Deacon was admired for her beauty, not loved for her humanity. Evelyn McLean was celebrated for her charm, not supported in her sorrow. Barbara Hutton was envied for her wealth, not valued for her spirit. Dorothy Arnold was expected to delight society, not express her dreams. Admiration demands perfection. Affection allows imperfection. These women received the former and were denied the latter. And in the absence of genuine affection, admiration becomes a burden, a pressure to maintain an image that crushes the person beneath it. The invisible inheritance, trauma. While the finances of these women were meticulously documented, their emotional inheritances were rarely acknowledged. Yet trauma shaped their lives far more powerfully than wealth ever could. Gladys inherited the trauma of witnessing violence and instability in her earliest years. Evelyn inherited the weight of a public life that forced her to hide her grief. Barbara inherited loneliness and abandonment disguised as privilege. Dorothy inherited the pressure of generations of Arnold expectations. Trauma is not always loud. Sometimes it appears as perfectionism, people-pleasing, reckless generosity, dissociation, withdrawal, identity confusion, emotional numbness. These women displayed all of these traits, but society, lacking the vocabulary of modern psychology, responded not with compassion but with judgment. A life lived in rooms that were too big. Their mansions were magnificent, vast, architectural wonders filled with rare art and priceless antiques. But large rooms do not guarantee a large life. In fact, these enormous spaces often amplified their loneliness. Grand staircases that echoed with no footsteps. Ballrooms silent between seasons. Bedrooms filled with designer gowns but devoid of comfort. Dining rooms set for 20 when only one person was expected. Their homes were theaters, not sanctuaries. Showplaces, not safe places. Monuments, not havens. In such an environment, the boundary between spectacle and isolation becomes razor thin. These women were always surrounded by people and yet profoundly alone. What happens when a woman's life is not her own? Each woman lived a life predetermined by others. Gladys was expected to be a duchess before she was allowed to be a person. Evelyn was expected to be a social icon before she was allowed to grieve. Barbara was expected to be a symbol before she was allowed to be a child. Dorothy was expected to be a debutante before she was allowed to write. Their paths were scripted long before they were born. Their desires, fears, and ambitions were secondary to the roles they were required to perform. And when they attempted to deviate, when they sought autonomy, they found themselves punished, ridiculed, silenced, or erased. This is the core tragedy of the Gilded Age socialite. Her life belonged to everyone except herself. A world built on appearances cannot protect the heart. Everything around them was designed for display. Their gowns, their jewels, their homes, their marriages, their children, their very identities. But in a world obsessed with how things look rather than how people feel, emotional truth had no language. Vulnerability had no place. Grief had no audience. Mental illness had no diagnosis. Trauma had no name. And so, these women carried their burdens quietly, invisibly, until the weight became too much to bear. Gladys shattered under the pressure. Evelyn drowned in loss. Barbara withered in loneliness. Dorothy vanished into silence. Their worlds were gilded, yes, but gilding is thin. Beneath it lies something fragile, something easily broken, something human. Why their stories still matter. We study these women not because they were wealthy, but because their struggles reveal universal truths about the human condition. They teach us that money cannot buy emotional security. Beauty cannot guarantee belonging. Admiration cannot replace affection. Visibility cannot prevent loneliness. Performance cannot sustain identity. These truths resonate today more than ever. In a world where millions curate digital versions of themselves under pressures not unlike those faced by Gilded Age women, their lives force us to ask uncomfortable questions. What do we lose when we live for appearances? What happens when trauma goes untreated? What becomes of identity when shaped entirely by external forces? How many of us still chase validation instead of connection? How many still live in gilded cages of our own making? Their stories endure because they are not simply historical, they are human. As we move deeper into the psychological terrain of the Gilded Age, it becomes clear that the downfall of these socialites was not an aberration. It was an inevitability baked into the very foundations of the world they inhabited. The era's culture, built on competition, hierarchy, and spectacle, created a fertile ground for emotional instability, and the women at its summit bore the heaviest burden of all. They were raised to be flawless, and any flaw, whether physical, emotional, or moral, became a threat to the entire structure of their social standing. Their lives became battlegrounds where societal expectations clashed with private desires, where family obligation collided with personal truth, and where emotional needs were dismissed in service of image. In this sense, their tragedies were not personal failures but structural collapses, symptoms of a system that could not accommodate vulnerability. The inheritance of isolation. From childhood, these women were taught to maintain a certain distance elevated above ordinary people, separated even from peers, and guarded against anyone who might take advantage of their fortune or name. Ironically, this protection became a form of imprisonment. Gladys Deacon's early trauma, witnessing her family's violent scandal, left her emotionally unanchored. Yet rather than receiving support, she was thrust into a world where emotional expression was considered indecorous. Her isolation deepened until it manifested as paranoia and withdrawal. Evelyn McLean's high social position insulated her from ordinary life, but not from extraordinary grief. When tragedy struck, her social circle offered sympathy, but not understanding, condolences, but not comfort. She became more isolated with each loss. Barbara Hutton's childhood was a revolving carousel of servants, tutors, and distant relatives. She was surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone. Her inheritance was isolation disguised as privilege, a loneliness so profound that no amount of wealth could ever penetrate it. Dorothy Arnold, despite her family's prominence, had no outlet for her aspirations. She could not confide in friends, as doing so would risk gossip. She could not confide in family, as doing so would risk disappointment. Her isolation was so complete that even her disappearance remained misunderstood. Isolation, in their cases, was not an accident, it was an inheritance. A generational pattern rooted in social expectation. The illusion of control. These women were raised to believe that wealth granted control, but control is seldom a friend to the human heart. Gladys believed she could control her beauty, sculpting it into classical perfection. But the body is not marble, and her attempt to impose control resulted in destruction. Evelyn believed she could control fate itself, that superstition had no power over her. But fate, indifferent to belief, dealt her a series of blows that even her optimism could not absorb. Barbara believed she could control love through generosity. But love cannot be bought, and the more she gave, the more she was exploited. Dorothy believed she could control her destiny within the narrow confines of her family's expectations. But when she attempted to break free, the illusion collapsed entirely. Their belief in control was, tragically, a mirage shaped by their environment, a myth that told them they could manage or prevent chaos through charm, wealth, or willpower. But chaos, when it came, dismantled those illusions with devastating efficiency. The weight of legacy. Each of these women carried a legacy on her shoulders. The Deacon scandal, the Walsh McLean publishing dynasty, the Woolworth retail empire, the Arnold lineage tracing back to the Mayflower. Their identities were intertwined with these legacies from birth. But legacies can be heavy, especially when they limit the possibilities of a life. Gladys was expected to restore aristocratic grandeur as the Duchess of Marlborough. Evelyn was expected to uphold the image of the perfect society hostess. Barbara was expected to embody the Woolworth success story. Dorothy was expected to represent old American respectability. When they faltered, not because of moral failure, but because of human vulnerability, the weight of these legacies made recovery nearly impossible. Their personal struggles became public embarrassments, amplified by the very prominence that once elevated them. the era that consumed its daughters. History often celebrates the Gilded Age for its glamour, but behind the scenes, it was an era rife with emotional starvation. Men were shaped by ambition, women were shaped by expectation, children were shaped by absence, and families were shaped by silence. The emotional infrastructure required to support these women simply did not exist. Mental illness was misunderstood, trauma was ignored, desire was suppressed, ambition was discouraged, authenticity was punished. An era that produced unimaginable fortune also produced unimaginable loneliness. These women became the casualties of a world obsessed with appearances, a world that rewarded silence, encouraged suppression, and punished emotional truth. The echo that continues through time. Even now, their stories echo with relevance. In Gladys, we see the dangers of perfectionism. In Evelyn, we see the consequences of unspoken grief. In Barbara, we see the long shadow of childhood abandonment. In Dorothy, we see the tragedy of a voice denied expression. Their stories resonate because they illuminate universal patterns. The pressures faced by women, the impact of family expectation, the invisibility of emotional suffering, the destructive nature of silence trauma. And they remind us that the human heart, no matter how gilded the surroundings, remains fragile. If the Gilded Age was a grand stage, then its socialites were cast in roles that offered little room for improvisation. They were expected to be graceful, elegant, and decorous symbols of prosperity, not participants in their own lives. Their roles were predetermined before they could speak, and deviation from the script, no matter how subtle, was treated as a crisis. What makes their stories so haunting is not simply the tragedies they endured, but the forces that made those tragedies predictable. Their lives demonstrate how the architecture of privilege can create the conditions for profound emotional collapse. The burden of public womanhood. For Gilded Age socialites, identity was externalized from birth. Their worth was measured not by who they were, but by how they appeared, how they dressed, whom they married, how they moved through the world. Their bodies became canvases on which society painted its ideals. For Gladys, beauty became a prison. For Evelyn, glamour became a mask. For Barbara, wealth became a shield and then a weapon turned inward. For Dorothy, propriety became a cage she could not escape. Public womanhood in this era required constant vigilance. It demanded flawless presentation and emotional restraint. There was no space for fear, ambition, vulnerability, depression, doubt, desire. These aspects of humanity had no sanctioned expression within their social sphere. To express them was to risk reputation, a currency more fragile than money and more precious than jewels. The silence surrounding women's mental health. The emotional collapse of these women was not merely personal, it was systemic. Their eras provided no language for the psychological wounds they carried. A woman like Gladys, spiraling into paranoia and delusion, was not seen as ill, but as difficult, eccentric, or embarrassing. A woman like Evelyn, using substances to cope with unimaginable grief, was labeled reckless or irresponsible, not traumatized. A woman like Barbara, battling addiction, anorexia, and despair, was portrayed as spoiled and foolish, rather than deeply wounded. A woman like Dorothy, yearning for autonomy she was never allowed, was dismissed as naive until she disappeared entirely. Mental health was invisible, and invisibility kills not through violence, but through neglect. Love as a battlefield. Another recurring theme in their lives was the disastrous pursuit of love, not because they were incapable of loving, but because the environment around them distorted the very conditions under which love could flourish. Gladys spent decades chasing an aristocratic dream that turned her into a ghost of herself. Evelyn's search for connection unfolded under the shadow of wealth that attracted opportunists rather than partners. Barbara's marriages became cycles of exploitation and abandonment, each union peeling away another layer of her emotional resilience. Dorothy's only chance at romantic authenticity existed in secrecy, hidden letters, quiet meetings, forbidden dreams. For these women, love became an arena for struggle rather than sanctuary. They entered each relationship already, carrying enormous emotional deficits that no partner, no matter how stable, could have filled. The costs of living without autonomy. Autonomy, the ability to choose one's own path, is a central pillar of psychological well-being. These women never had it. Every step they took was monitored. Every choice was scrutinized. Every deviation was punished. When they attempted to express even the smallest form of independence, society responded with disapproval or outright force. Gladys lost her home. Evelyn lost her children. Barbara lost her agency. Dorothy lost her life. It is no coincidence that these losses coincide with attempts at autonomy. Their world viewed female independence as destabilizing a challenge to the social order that must be contained, the weight of wealth that offers no refuge. Their tragedies reveal a profound truth. Wealth, when used as a substitute for emotional nourishment, becomes corrosive. Money can purchase diversion. It cannot purchase meaning. Money can purchase attention. It cannot purchase affection. Money can purchase beauty. It cannot purchase belonging. Money can purchase privilege. It cannot purchase peace. In the absence of inner stability, wealth exaggerates vulnerabilities. It amplifies trauma, magnifies insecurities, and exposes emotional wounds to public scrutiny. The result is a paradox. The richest women of the Gilded Age lived some of the most emotionally impoverished lives. Their money insulated them from hardship, while simultaneously isolating them from humanity. What their downfalls reveal about the era. The downfall of Gilded Age socialites is more than a collection of personal tragedies. It is a piercing commentary on the era itself. Their stories expose 1. The fragility of reputational economies. Lives could crumble under the weight of scandal because identity was built on perception. 2. The dangers of emotional suppression. The lack of psychological language turned suffering into spectacle. 3. The destructive legacy of patriarchal control. Their dreams were sidelined, their roles predetermined, their autonomy denied. 4. The myth of protective wealth. Money shielded them from poverty but left them defenseless against emotional devastation. Their lives reveal the contradictions of the Gilded Age, a world built on excess but hollow at the core, glittering on the surface but quietly decaying beneath. What makes the stories of these Gilded Age women so enduring is not merely the scale of their misfortune, but the clarity with which their lives illuminate the hidden architecture of an era. Their narratives function as case studies, living documents that reveal the psychological ecosystem of extreme wealth, rigid social hierarchy, and gendered constraint. Through them, we see the Gilded Age not as a parade of opulence, but as a pressure chamber where human frailty was magnified rather than eased. Their lives were demonstrations of what happens when external abundance collides with internal scarcity. The myth of the protected woman. The Gilded Age elite prided themselves on protecting their daughters. Protection, however, often meant restriction. It meant insulating them from experience, filtering their interactions, shaping their thinking, and limiting their freedoms in the name of safeguarding reputation. Gladys was protected from scandal until the scandal came from within her own home. Evelyn was protected by wealth, yet helpless in the face of tragedy. Barbara was protected from want, yet deprived of emotional stability. Dorothy was protected from impropriety, yet denied the autonomy to build the life she longed for. Protection, in their cases, did not prevent harm. It merely ensured that when harm came, they had no tools with which to survive it. True protection empowers. False protection confines. These women lived under the latter, the double-edged sword of inheritance. Inheritance in the Gilded Age operated at two levels: material inheritance, money, houses, jewels, stocks; emotional inheritance, trauma, expectations, repression, silence. The first bestowed privilege, the second imposed destiny. Material inheritance gave these women access to beauty, luxury, travel, and influence. Emotional inheritance forced them into patterns that mirrored the dysfunction of the generations before them. Gladys inherited instability, wrapped in aristocratic glamour. Evelyn inherited optimism shadowed by tragedy. Barbara inherited wealth, accompanied by abandonment and betrayal. Dorothy inherited perfectionism threaded with suffocation. Each woman became a vessel carrying both of these inheritances. And when the emotional burden outweighed the material cushion, collapse became inevitable. The currency of reputation. In Gilded Age society, reputation functioned as an invisible currency more valuable than money, more fragile than crystal. A single rumor could damage a marriage, erase a career, or fracture a dynasty. The pressure to maintain reputation forced these women to live in a constant state of surveillance and performance. Every gesture was evaluated, every friendship analyzed, every article of clothing judged, every deviation noticed. For Gladys, The disintegration of her beauty was not just a personal crisis, it was a reputational catastrophe. For Evelyn, public sorrow was limited to acceptable displays. Anything more was seen as instability. For Barbara, every misstep became tabloid fodder, turning her life into a spectacle. For Dorothy, reputation silenced her parents into inaction during the most critical weeks of her disappearance. Reputation shaped their destinies more forcefully than fortune ever did. The public appetite for tragedy. The public fascination with these women's suffering reveals an uncomfortable truth. Society has always been enthralled by the downfall of the privileged. In newspapers, salons, and later in movies and magazines, their stories were consumed as entertainment. Gladys's descent into isolation became gossip. Evelyn's misfortunes were treated as proof of a curse. Barbara's collapses were framed as cautionary tales. Dorothy's disappearance became a national obsession. Their tragedies were packaged as morality plays lessons in what happens when wealth is misused, or when women overreach, or when privilege fails to protect. These interpretations were not only simplistic, they were cruel. They stripped these women of humanity, turning them into symbols rather than individuals. In reality, their tragedies were rooted not in personal flaws, but in systemic forces that remain recognizable in modern society. The unseen labor of perfection. Perfection is often perceived as effortless. But for these women, perfection required enormous labor, emotional, physical, and psychological. They worked constantly to uphold perfect posture, perfect beauty, perfect manners, perfect marriages, perfect social calendars. The effort required to maintain these illusions was staggering, and perfection, by its nature, is impossible to sustain indefinitely. Gladys's pursuit of physical perfection led her to a procedure that destroyed her life. Evelyn's attempts to appear unshaken forced her to bottle grief until it became unbearable. Barbara's pursuit of perfect romance repeated the same cycles of heartbreak. Dorothy's attempts to meet family expectations suffocated her creative aspirations. When perfection becomes a mandate, failure becomes a certainty. The slow erosion of identity. Perhaps the most devastating thread connecting these women is the gradual erosion of self. Each one, in different ways, lost the ability to see her own identity separate from society's expectations. Gladys lost herself in the mirror. Evelyn lost herself in her tragedies. Barbara lost herself in the people she loved. Dorothy lost herself in the life she never got to live. This erosion did not happen suddenly. It happened quietly, incrementally, over years of performing roles that left no room for authenticity. Identity, when built solely on external validation, eventually collapses, and when it collapses, it often takes everything else down with it. The deeper we look into the lives of Gilded Age socialites, the clearer it becomes that their suffering did not occur in isolation. Their stories were not individual misfortunes, but symptoms of a broader societal pattern, one that treated women as ornamental, disposable, and fundamentally secondary. The wealth that surrounded them did not protect them. It merely made their struggles more visible, their downfalls more dramatic, and their pain more quietly devastating. Their tragedies reveal not the failures of individuals, but the failures of an era that valued image over identity, reputation over reality, and perfection over personhood. When wealth becomes a cage, one of the most persistent myths of the Gilded Age is that vast wealth granted freedom. In reality, for women, immense wealth often tightened the constraints around their lives. With wealth came more scrutiny, more expectations, more restrictions, more obligations, more pressure. Wealth, instead of expanding their world, narrowed it. Gladys could not choose her husband freely because her beauty was considered a bargaining chip. Evelyn could not mourn freely because her social role demanded composure. Barbara could not love freely because her wealth attracted opportunists. Dorothy could not live freely because her family's name dictated her choices. Freedom was a privilege they were denied, even as they appeared to embody privilege itself. The social costs of being a lady. The concept of the lady in the Gilded Age was rigid and unforgiving. To be a lady meant never showing anger, never showing grief, never expressing desire, never displaying ambition, never revealing vulnerability. It meant existing as a symbol rather than a person, a curated ideal rather than an authentic human being. Gladys Deacon, with her wit and sharp intelligence, constantly exceeded the emotional boundaries set for her. Society punished her for it. Evelyn McLean, with her lively spirit and irreverent sense of humor, often clashed with the somber expectations of old Washington. Barbara Hutton, with her generosity and sensitivity, was deemed frivolous for expressing genuine emotion. Dorothy Arnold, daring to pursue a writing career, threatened the prescribed image of an elite young lady. To be a lady was to be admired, but never truly seen. The unspoken contracts of the aristocracy. Every socialite operated under an invisible but enforceable contract. You will maintain the family's reputation. You will secure an advantageous marriage. You will support your husband's ambitions. You will bear children to continue the lineage. You will never tarnish the family name. Failure to uphold any part of this contract was met with consequences, legal, social, or psychological. Gladys was cast out of Blenheim Palace the moment her eccentricities became inconvenient. Evelyn was condemned by gossip columns whenever her grief became too public. Barbara was criticized relentlessly for seeking affection outside the bounds of her marriages. Dorothy was erased from family memory when her disappearance threatened embarrassment. These contracts were not written anywhere. They did not need to be. They were understood implicitly, taught from childhood, and enforced by social networks far more powerful than any legal system. Why society punished their humanity. Each woman, in her own way, attempted to break free from the constraints of her class and gender. Gladys sought intellectual equality with men. Evelyn sought emotional authenticity. Barbara sought unconditional love. Dorothy sought independence and creative expression. But society punished these desires precisely because they threatened to reveal the truth, that the lives of wealthy women were not enviable, but often suffocating. The public could not allow these women to be human. Their humanity would expose the cracks in the glamorous facade of wealth. So instead, their suffering was sensationalized. Their mistakes were magnified. Their ambitions were mocked. Their mental health struggles were dismissed. Their humanity became inconvenient, the slow unraveling of Gilded Age illusions. As their lives unfolded, the illusions of the Gilded Age began to crumble. The illusion that wealth guaranteed happiness. The illusion that beauty guaranteed stability. The illusion that marriage guaranteed security. The illusion that reputation guaranteed protection. The illusion that privilege guaranteed freedom. Each woman's downfall peeled away part of the gilding, revealing the truth beneath. The Gilded Age was built on surfaces. Surfaces crack. Surfaces crumble. Surfaces cannot hold weight. And beneath the gold leaf lay very human struggles. Struggles that money, status, and beauty were never equipped to solve. The lingering echo of their stories. Today, more than a century later, the stories of Gladys, Evelyn, Barbara, and Dorothy continue to resonate because the pressures they faced have merely changed shape. Women today still echo their struggles. The relentless pursuit of perfection, the pressure to perform socially, the invisibility of emotional wounds, the balancing act between image and identity, the fear of disappointing family expectations, the difficulty of creating autonomy in constrained environments. Their lives remind us that progress is uneven, and that emotional truths often persist long after eras end. We study them not because they were wealthy, but because their lives expose universal vulnerabilities, the longing to be loved, the fear of being misunderstood, the struggle for self-definition, the weight of expectation, the pain of loneliness, the desire for freedom. As the decades passed and the Gilded Age faded into memory, the lives of these women became cautionary tales, whispered across generations and dissected by historians, psychologists, and cultural critics. Yet beneath the fascination lies a deeper truth. They were not anomalies. They were products of a system that demanded perfection, ignored suffering, and punished authenticity. Their stories reveal patterns predictable, tragic patterns that emerge whenever wealth and patriarchy intersect, whenever appearance is valued over emotional reality, and whenever women are forced to live lives designed by anyone except themselves. Why their pain was invisible to the world around them. One of the most striking aspects of these women's lives is how little those closest to them understood the depth of their suffering. This was not due to lack of observation, it was due to lack of emotional vocabulary. The Gilded Age did not possess the language to describe the psychological fractures these women endured. Depression was melancholy. Trauma was hysteria. Grief was over-sentimentality. Mental illness was eccentricity. Autonomy was rebellion. These euphemisms smoothed over the sharp edges of their suffering, turning crises into character flaws and emotional wounds into personal failings. Gladys's deteriorating mental health was dismissed as odd behavior. Evelyn's profound grief was trivialized as superstition. Barbara's lifelong abandonment wounds were interpreted as irresponsibility. Dorothy's yearning for independence was treated as immaturity. Their pain was visible, but it was not recognized. The patriarchal machinery behind their downfalls. Every influential man in their lives, fathers, husbands, lawyers, guardians, shared one thing: control over the decisions that shaped these women's destinies. This control was not merely social, it was legal and cultural. Men controlled their finances, their social calendar, their inheritance, their property, their movements, their marriages, their bodies, even their emotional lives were regulated. A woman expressing dissatisfaction risked being labeled unstable. A woman seeking independence risked being cut off financially. A woman choosing a partner risked family disgrace. A woman pursuing ambition risked social exile. Gladys was discarded when her beauty no longer served aristocratic expectations. Evelyn was pressured into maintaining social appearances rather than healing. Barbara's wealth made her a target for exploitative men who drained her resources. Dorothy's choices were overridden until her only available escape was disappearance. Their tragedies were not random. They were the predictable result of a system that granted women visibility without agency. The contradiction at the heart of their lives. These women lived in an era that both idolized and infantilized them. They were idolized for their beauty, wealth, and charm. They were infantilized in every aspect of decision-making, autonomy, and desire. This contradiction created a psychological tension impossible to resolve. You must be extraordinary, but you may not make extraordinary choices. You must appear happy, but you may not pursue what brings you happiness. You must be admired, but you may not draw attention to your struggles. You must seem independent, but you may not act independently. This tension fractured their lives from the inside out. Gladys tried to shape her identity through beauty and lost herself. Evelyn tried to carry her grief publicly but was punished for it. Barbara tried to buy affection but found exploitation instead. Dorothy tried to write her own story but disappeared before she could finish it. They lived in a paradox that no human being could sustain: the cruel economics of female worth. In the Gilded Age, a woman's worth was calculated using a formula far removed from her character or intellect. Worth equals beauty plus reputation plus marriage market value. Intelligence was irrelevant unless it came packaged with charm. Ambition was discouraged unless it reflected well on the family. Emotional needs were unimportant unless they threatened scandal. Every decision these women made was weighed against a single question: how will this reflect on the family name? Gladys was valuable until her beauty faded and then she was pushed out. Evelyn was valuable as a hostess until grief disrupted her role. Barbara was valuable as an heiress until her wealth was drained by those she trusted. Dorothy was valuable as a debutante until she sought independence. Their worthiness was conditional, fragile, and ultimately disposable. A slow descent, not a sudden fall. Another painful truth is that none of these women collapsed suddenly. Their suffering was slow, gradual, and visible long before their ultimate tragedies. Gladys's unraveling began in childhood. Evelyn's tragedies accumulated over decades. Barbara's loneliness deepened long before her finances crumbled. Dorothy's disappearance was preceded by months of emotional distress. But their world did not allow intervention. To intervene would require acknowledging their pain, their humanity, their inner lives, their unmet needs, their desires, their agency. And the Gilded Age was simply not designed to accommodate those realities. What their lives reveal about the price of silence. The greatest shared tragedy among these women is silence, the silence imposed on them, and the silence they internalized. Gladys was silenced by aristocratic expectations. Evelyn was silenced by the pressure to remain cheerful. Barbara was silenced by the belief that wealth should erase suffering. Dorothy was silenced by family propriety until she vanished entirely. Silence was both their shield and their downfall. Silence preserved reputation. Silence maintained social order. Silence prevented scandal. Silence protected powerful men, but silence also suffocated authenticity, freedom, mental health, identity, desire, connection, and in the end, silence consumed each of them in different ways. As the decades pressed on, the stories of these women grew into cultural myths, tales retold in drawing rooms, newspapers, documentaries, and whispered recollections. But myths, while memorable, often obscure the human beings at their center. To truly understand the Gilded Age socialites who lost everything, we must strip away the myth-making and examine the emotional landscapes that shaped their fates. These women lived inside worlds that demanded perfection, but offered no tools to withstand imperfection. Their tragedies were not merely the result of personal flaws or poor decisions, they were the inevitable outcomes of a society that prized conformity over authenticity, visibility over dignity, and glamour over truth. The social machine that consumed them, the Gilded Age elite operated like a machine, rigid, polished, efficient, and indifferent. This machine required public image, strategic marriages, strict gender roles, obsessive control, constant performance. Anyone who failed to operate smoothly within it risked being crushed by its mechanisms. Gladys was consumed when she attempted to redesign herself physically. Evelyn was consumed when she tried to carry grief in a world that refused to acknowledge it. Barbara was consumed when her wealth became both her armor and her downfall. Dorothy was consumed when she dared step outside the machine entirely. This machine did not tolerate deviation, because deviation exposed its fragility. Why their downfalls look different but feel the same. Each woman's story unfolded uniquely, one in aristocratic halls, one in Washington society, one in global luxury estates, and one in the brownstones of Manhattan. Yet their emotional journeys follow the same arc: early promise, growing internal conflict, attempts at autonomy, punishment or collapse, isolation, tragic or unresolved ending. The settings change, the details change, the wealth levels change, but the underlying emotional patterns remain identical. Their stories are mirrors, reflecting the same flaw in the system, the psychological burden of being constantly observed. To live in the Gilded Age elite was to exist under perpetual scrutiny. Every movement, gesture, and expression could become gossip, commentary, or scandal. Imagine never relaxing your posture, never showing sadness in public, never expressing anger, never making a mistake, never revealing insecurity, never confiding honestly in anyone. The human psyche cannot thrive under such conditions. It can barely survive. This constant observation led to predictable outcomes: hypervigilance, self-criticism, self-objectification, emotional numbing, identity distortion, paranoia. Gladys exhibited paranoia as her world shrank. Evelyn wore cheerfulness as a mask until she collapsed beneath it. Barbara pursued love obsessively, searching for what observation stole from her. Dorothy retreated into secrecy until she disappeared altogether. Observation without understanding is not admiration, it is surveillance. How wealth creates emotional blind spots. One of the cruel paradoxes in these women's lives is that wealth often prevented others from recognizing the severity of their suffering. Their fortunes created a shield, one that blocked compassion as effectively as hardship. People assumed, she has everything. She has no real problems. She has resources to fix anything. She is just dramatic. She is just spoiled. She is just difficult. These assumptions erase their humanity. Wealth made their pain invisible not because it wasn't there, but because people refused to believe it could exist. Gladys's suffering was dismissed as vanity. Evelyn's sorrow was dismissed as melodrama. Barbara's breakdowns were dismissed as indulgence. Dorothy's distress was dismissed as childish rebellion. Wealth did not protect them. It hid them. The tragedy of dreams in a world without permission. All four women had dreams that clashed with the roles their society assigned. Gladys dreamed of intellectual companionship and artistic influence. Evelyn dreamed of freedom from superstition and expectation. Barbara dreamed of love unclouded by wealth. Dorothy dreamed of becoming a writer and shaping her own life story. But dreams require permission, and permission was rarely granted. Their desires were treated as inconveniences. Their ambitions were treated as defects. Their attempts at self-determination were treated as scandals. When a woman's authenticity is punished, her dreams become liabilities. When her dreams become liabilities, she must bury them. And when dreams are buried, the self is buried with them. The inheritance of emotional starvation. Despite their vast estates, ornate homes, and lavish surroundings, what these women lacked most was something that cannot be bought: emotional nourishment. They lacked consistency, attunement, safety, unconditional affection, support during crisis, permission to feel fully human. Families of immense fortune often distribute wealth generously, but emotional warmth sparingly. The result is a form of starvation masked by abundance. Gladys received admiration, not affection. Evelyn received attention, not understanding. Barbara received extravagance, not stability. Dorothy received expectation, not empathy. Emotional starvation does not lead to immediate collapse. It leads to a lifelong search for what was never given. The cost of becoming a symbol. Each woman became a symbol of beauty, of wealth, of tragedy, of mystery. But symbols do not get to be human. Symbols are simplified versions of reality. Gladys became the tragic duchess. Evelyn became the cursed heiress. Barbara became the poor little rich girl. Dorothy became the society girl who vanished. Once a woman becomes a symbol, she loses the right to complexity. Her story becomes a narrative crafted by others, press, family, historians, until her truth is no longer recognizable. It is one of the cruelest erasures imaginable.